Welcome back. If this is your first time here, you found the right place. Tonight's compilation is 5 accounts from the Southwest Desert, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. 5 different people, 5 different jobs. A land surveyor outside Gallup, a construction crew near Holbrook, a mail carrier in the Nevada high desert, a search and rescue team in the Sandia foothills, a fence contractor outside Winslow. None of them were looking for anything unusual. All of them found the same thing. Every story in this compilation follows someone who went out to work on a piece of land and came back changed, not because of what chased them, because of what was already there before they arrived, and what made absolutely certain they understood that. Get comfortable. These run long. That is the point. Settle in, turn the volume up, and let the desert do what the desert does. Thank you for being here tonight. This channel is built by people who take these accounts seriously, and it exists because you keep showing up. Before we get into it, drop a comment and tell us, have you ever been somewhere in the Southwest and felt like the land itself was watching you back? A trail, a back road, a piece of open country that made the hair stand up for no reason you could explain. We want to hear it. The comments on this one are going to be something. Now, story 1. The survey. The footsteps in the caliche matched mine exactly. Same stride, same depth. I stopped walking. They kept going. I have been a licensed land surveyor for 16 years. I have worked in every kind of terrain the Southwest throws at a person. Sandstone canyon country, hardpan alkaline flats, high desert mesa where the wind comes off the Colorado Plateau and cuts right through whatever you're wearing, no matter the season. I have surveyed land adjacent to active mine operations, land caught in 3 county jurisdictional disputes at once, land so remote it required a full day of 4-wheel driving just to reach the nearest benchmark. I am not a superstitious person. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what happened outside Gallup in the fall of 2019, because nothing about what I experienced fits neatly into a category that the licensing board would recognize, and I have spent a long time working out how to talk about it without sounding like someone who lost his grip on things. My name isn't the point. What matters is the job, and what the job turned into. I'll say this much about working in the Four Corners region before I get into the specifics. You pick things up over the years. Not ghost stories, I have no patience for ghost stories, but a kind of regional literacy. You learn which counties have more unexplained missing person cases than the terrain alone can account for. You learn which BLM field offices have an unusual number of equipment malfunction reports in their files. You learn the names of the tribal historic preservation officers in each district, and you call them early in a project before you put a single pin in the ground, because those relationships are how you avoid losing 2 days of work and a government contract. You learn which parcels have a reputation, and you learn to notice when a client hasn't done their homework on a piece of ground. In 16 years of Southwest survey work, I had encountered things I couldn't explain on maybe 3 or 4 jobs. Odd readings, equipment that reset itself without being touched, sounds without sources. I had filed those observations away as anomalies and moved on, because moving on is what the work requires. What happened in McKinley County was different in kind, not just in degree. I want to be precise about that. I was contracted through my firm to perform a preliminary boundary assessment on a parcel of Bureau of Land Management ground in McKinley County, New Mexico. Approximately 420 acres of high desert scrub, positioned roughly 18 miles southeast of Gallup, out where the highway gives way to Gravel County Road, and the Gravel County Road gives way to 2-track, and the 2-track eventually just becomes a set of old tire ruts through scrub that you follow on faith. The client was a development company based out of Phoenix. Their acquisitions manager had sent us a standard packet, topographic maps, a preliminary title search, GPS coordinates for the 4 corner monuments. Nothing unusual in any of it. The job was scoped for 2 days. 1 day to walk the boundary and establish control points. 1 day to run the traverse and close the loop. My field partner on the job was Ruben Castillo. Ruben had been working with me for 6 years at that point. He was the kind of field technician who shows up early and doesn't need to be managed. He's already thinking 2 steps ahead of whatever you're doing, already knows where the next setup goes, already has the rod positioned before you finish leveling the instrument. We got along because neither of us talked much during working hours, which in my experience is one of the rare qualities you find in a field partner. We drove out from Albuquerque the night before the job, checked into a motel on the east side of Gallup, ate at a place that served decent green chili, and were in bed by 9. We were on site the following morning before 7. The land itself was what you'd expect from that part of New Mexico in mid-October. Dry, cold at first light, warming slowly through the morning. The soil was a mix of sandy clay and caliche, that pale, calcified hardpan that forms in arid soils over centuries and makes driving stakes feel like hammering into compressed chalk. The elevation was around 6,800 feet, which meant the air tasted thin, and the sun, when it finally cleared the ridge to the east, felt harder than it deserved to at that latitude. Juniper scrub scattered across the flats, some cholla cactus along the arroyo margins, patches of black grama grass that hadn't fully gone dormant yet, and here and there the dark skeleton of a dead pinon, bark long gone, wood bleached gray. The kind of country that looks empty from a distance, but isn't. You find cottontail tracks in the morning caliche dust, coyote scat along the dry washes, pronghorn sign in the softer sandy arroyos where the soil holds an impression overnight. The land had been grazed at some point in its recent history. There were cedar fence posts throughout, some still holding rusted wire, most not, scattered like they'd been there so long the desert had stopped noticing them. We set up our base station at the southwest corner monument, a brass cap set in concrete, old enough that the inspector's stamp was partially obscured by calcareous crust. I scraped it clean with my knife while Ruben set up the tripod and leveled the total station. The corner matched our GPS position within acceptable tolerance. We photographed it, logged the coordinates in the field book, and started working the west boundary line north. The first thing I noticed that I would later wish I had paid more attention to came at around 9 in the morning, maybe 45 minutes into the traverse. There was a dry wash crossing the parcel roughly 200 yards north of the southwest corner. Nothing unusual about a wash in that country. They run everywhere through the mesa and canyon terrain of the southern Colorado Plateau, cutting shallow channels that only carry water during summer storm events and then sit bone dry the rest of the year. What was unusual was the concentration of material along the bank. Ceramic sherds, quite a few of them, scattered across a roughly 20-foot section of the wash bank. Buff-colored body fragments with black geometric designs painted on, angular, precise patterns, in a style I recognized from cultural resource surveys I'd done in the Four Corners area. Some of the pieces were large enough that I could see the vessel form implied by the curve of the clay. There were also a handful of flat stones along the bank that had been shaped deliberately, edges napped, surfaces smoothed by what looked like long use. A few larger fragments of a gray-brown ceramic without any decoration, the kind that often turns up alongside painted wares at ancestral Pueblo and occupation sites. What I noticed, kneeling there at the wash bank with my camera out, was the density of the scatter. Sherds at a site boundary tend to be sparse, thinned out by wind and erosion over centuries. This concentration was tight enough that I found myself wondering if we were sitting directly above something larger. The wash had cut down through maybe 4 feet of soil and caliche along this stretch, and the exposed profile of the bank showed stratified layers, pale caliche, then darker organic-rich soil above it, then another band of caliche at the top. The sherds were coming out of that middle dark layer. Whatever had been there had been buried, and the wash had done the excavating over time. Standard practice on any BLM job requires you to document potential archaeological finds and report them through the appropriate channels. I photographed everything with the site camera, measured and logged the GPS positions of the find locations, and noted it in the field book as possible historic surface scatter associated with an as-yet unidentified site. I asked Ruben to take a few additional close-up photos while I wrote the notes. He crouched over the sherds for a moment, picked up one of the larger painted fragments, turned it over in his hand, and set it back down exactly where he'd found it. He didn't say anything. I noted his expression, which was careful in a way that didn't match the routine nature of what we were doing. Ruben grew up in the Rio Grande Valley. He had family from Isleta, Pueblo. He understood, without needing to explain himself, that we were not in neutral piece of ground. We had productive hours through the rest of the morning and into early afternoon. Ruben and I worked the way we always did, minimal conversation, efficient handoffs, each of us moving to the next position while the other was still recording the previous one. We had been doing this together long enough that the rhythm of it was automatic. Instruments set up to rod position, to reading, to field book entry, to move over and over across the scrub. The terrain was cooperative. No major grade changes, no brush thick enough to block the line of sight between setups. The caliche surface hard enough that we could drive stakes without the kind of effort that wears you down over a long traverse. We ate lunch at the truck a little past noon. Ruben had a thermos of coffee he was willing to share, which in 6 years was the closest thing to generosity I had ever seen from him on a job. We sat on the tailgate and looked at the land. The overcast had come and gone and come back by then, the sky cycling between thin winter blue and pale gray. A raven landed on a juniper about 40 feet from the truck, looked at us for a long moment, and flew away southwest. Ruben watched it go. He said, without any particular emphasis, "Somebody's been on this parcel recently." I asked what made him think so. He pointed at the juniper where the raven had been. At the base of it, barely visible in the sparse shade, was a piece of fabric. Torn, faded, but not old. A strip of dark cloth, maybe from a jacket. No one leaves fabric like that in the field, unless they've been moving through in a hurry and caught it on a branch. We walked over to look. The strip was dark blue, maybe 12 inches long. No blood on it. No other sign nearby. I photographed it and added a note to the field book, but didn't give it a lot of weight at the time. People hike through BLM land without permission all the time. This had been someone, I assumed, who had moved through quickly and lost a piece of their gear to the brush. I got back to the traverse. The last control point for the day was in the southeast quadrant of the parcel, about 40 yards from where the old wash turned south and exited the property boundary. I was setting the iron pin while Ruben held the prism rod at the prior monument, roughly 300 feet to my east. The sun was dropping toward the ridge. An hour and a half of useful light left, maybe less. I was mid-swing with the hammer when the sound stopped me. It came from the direction of the wash. Not wind. The wind had died down by then, and the juniper wasn't moving. Not an animal startled out of the brush, which tends to produce a sharp, sudden burst of sound, and then nothing. This was deliberate. A slow, measured series of sounds from below the wash bank. Footsteps, specifically. The kind that sound like someone picking their way carefully over dry ground, trying not to make noise, not quite succeeding. They were rhythmic enough that I could count the pace, and they stopped when I stopped swinging the hammer. I stood still for 10 or 12 seconds, nothing. Then I swung the hammer again, and the sound resumed. I put the hammer down, and the sound stopped. I called to Ruben on the radio. He came over, rod tucked under his arm. I explained what I'd heard. We stood together at the edge of the wash bank and listened. The dry channel below us was empty, visible for maybe 60 feet in each direction before it curved. No movement, no animal sign. No boot prints in the sandy floor of the wash that I could see from above. After about half a minute, a coyote called from somewhere to the northwest, and Ruben said it was probably a coyote down in the wash. They move in ways that can sound more deliberate than you expect when you're not looking at them. I agreed that was the most reasonable explanation. I set the control point, we packed up the equipment, and we drove back to Gallup. I did not sleep particularly well that night. I told myself it was the altitude and the dry air, which are both true things that affect sleep. I ate dinner, reviewed the day's data, found it clean, and turned the light off by 10:30. We were back on the parcel the next morning by 6:45. I want to describe to you what we found when we got there, because it is where my professional certainty in the job began to come apart. And I want you to understand that I have reconstructed this many times in the years since, from my field notes, from the GPS data log, from Ruben's own written account, and I cannot find an error in my perception. What we found was what we found. Every control point we had set the prior day had been moved. Not pulled out and left on the ground. Not knocked over. Repositioned. Each iron pin had been extracted from its set location and driven into the ground at a new position. The new positions were geometrically consistent with the old positions. They occupied the same relative relationship to one another, but each one had been moved inward from the property boundary by a uniform distance. I measured them before I did anything else. 8 feet. Each pin relocated 8 feet toward the interior of the parcel, with the same precision to the foot, all 4 of them. I walked the line twice before I said anything. Ruben came behind me with the tape. Neither of us spoke for a while. When he finally said something, it was just, "This isn't vandalism." And he was right. Vandalism is random, or at least careless. This was careful. Whoever or whatever had moved those pins had understood the geometry of what we were doing and had responded to it with a counter-geometry of their own, move the boundary in, shrink the territory we were claiming, push us back from whatever line we were drawing through the land. There were no boot prints around the new pin positions. The caliche surface around each relocated point was compacted in the way you'd expect from a pin being driven with force, but there were no impressions radiating outward from the site. On a surface that holds every rabbit track and every wind-carried seed that lands on it, the absence of any footwear impression was something I could not explain. I want to be clear about the ground conditions, because I know the first thing a rational person does with a story like this is look for the soft spot in the observation. The caliche around the southwest and southeast corner areas was hard, which does not hold prints. But the northwest and northeast corner monuments sat on softer sandy soil near the wash where the substrate was alluvial. I had tracked my own boot prints to those positions the prior day and could see them clearly when I walked back in that morning. The pins had been moved through that same soft substrate without leaving a mark. I photographed the soil around each monument. The photos are still in my project file. There is nothing around those pins but compacted earth. I documented everything. Photographed each position, took measurements, recorded the offsets in the field book. I drove to a spot with cell service on the county road and called our project contact at the development company. He said vandalism and unauthorized access were known issues in the area, told me to document it carefully and proceed, and thanked me for the call. I wrote incident note 1 in my field book. I number every anomaly observation and date it, a habit I've maintained for my entire career. We reset all 4 control points and returned to the traverse. By 10 in the morning we were running the south boundary line, working our way west across the lower end of the parcel. The sky had clouded over during our drive back in from the county road, not threatening weather, just the high overcast that moves through that country without committing to anything. Temperature around 48 degrees, wind from the northwest at maybe 10 miles an hour. I had Ruben about 250 feet ahead of me holding the rod while I shot angles from the instrument. I was in the middle of recording a reading when I smelled something that didn't belong. It was an organic smell. Wet clay turned earth like a grave opened in rain, specific enough that I stopped what I was doing and tried to identify the source. The soil around me was dry. There had been no precipitation in the area in weeks. The smell had no source I could see, and it faded after maybe 30 seconds, replaced by the clean juniper and cold air smell of the high desert. Then Ruben's radio clicked twice. 2 clicks was our signal for hold position. I looked up from the instrument. He was standing at the rod but not looking at me. He was looking north, toward the interior of the parcel, toward the dry wash. I clicked back twice. He didn't move. I lifted the instrument off the tripod, left it sitting on the ground, and walked to him. When I was close enough to see his face clearly, I stopped. Ruben is not a person given to visible emotion in the field. 16 years of outdoor work and 6 years specifically of working with me had given him a professional composure that I had come to rely on as a baseline for reading a situation. What I saw in his face was not fear. It was something I can only describe as the expression a person makes when a fact is in front of them that their experience has not given them Any tools to process, he said. Someone just called my name. I asked him where from. He pointed north, toward the wash, maybe 200 yards into the interior of the parcel. I asked, a person? A voice? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it was my voice. I had no immediate response to that. We stood side by side and looked north. The land was flat enough that you could see a standing person against the skyline for half a mile in any direction. There was nothing. The juniper was too short and too sparse to conceal an adult at that distance. No birds moving, which I noticed. The area had been quiet with crows and ravens all morning, and now nothing was moving. I told Reuben it was probably acoustic distortion, which is a real phenomenon in open desert country. Sound bounces off terrain features in ways that can produce effects that sound like voices at distances and from directions that don't correspond to the source. He nodded and said nothing else about it. We went back to the traverse. We finished the south boundary run by 1:15 in the afternoon and broke for lunch at the truck. I ate quickly, drank coffee from the thermos, and was reviewing the morning's data on the collector when I looked up and saw the figure. It was standing at the north edge of the parcel, at the approximate location of the dry wash, stationary. At a quarter mile, it was a dark shape against the pale, overcast sky. No detail visible at that range, but clearly upright and human-formed in its general outline. I watched it for probably 3 full minutes. It did not move. It did not turn. It faced south toward us and held perfectly still in the way that a person holds still when they are watching something and don't want to be caught doing it. I pointed it out to Reuben. He had already seen it. He was eating a sandwich and watching it over the tailgate of the truck with a neutral expression I recognized as his working face, the one that meant he was gathering information and hadn't reached a conclusion yet. I got the binoculars from the back seat. 8-power glass, good quality, the kind we use for flagging and sighting over long distances. I found the figure and tried to resolve it. At 8-power magnification, the first thing I noticed was the clothing. Dark, heavy, a long coat, or something similar, something that moved a little with the wind, but not enough for what I would have expected. The second thing I noticed was the proportions. The arms were longer than they should have been. Not dramatically, not cartoonishly, but long enough that the hands hanging at the sides sat too far below where the hip joint would be on a person of that apparent height. The head was slightly large, and the posture conveyed something that I want to be careful about how I describe, not a human posture of someone standing watching, but something closer to a posture of waiting, of patience, without intention to move. And then I looked at the legs. The figure was standing on a slight rise in the terrain, which meant its lower half was visible against the pale caliche background, rather than against the sky. The thighs and knee joints were in the standard position you'd expect from a standing person. But below the knee, both legs were wrong. The lower leg angled back, rather than continuing to drop forward, as a human lower leg does in a standing position. The feet were on the ground, but they were making contact with the ground at an angle that would require the knee joint to bend in a direction it doesn't bend in any mammal I'm aware of. It was subtle. If I hadn't been specifically looking at the anatomy through 8-power glass with a surveyor's eye for precise measurement, I might have dismissed it as a trick of the terrain, a slight depression in the ground surface, something that created an optical effect. But I was looking at it carefully, and it was wrong. I put the binoculars down and told Reuben we were packing up. He didn't argue. He looked at me for half a second with a question on his face, and I said, "Now." And that was enough. We broke down the total station and packed the equipment into the truck cases in under 6 minutes. When I looked back toward the north end of the parcel during the pack-up, the figure was still there, still stationary, still facing south. I checked 3 times during the process of loading the gear. It did not move, did not turn, did not do anything that a person standing in a field and watching 2 men pack up their truck would naturally do. A person shifts weight. A person adjusts their position. A person, after watching for several minutes, does something. This did nothing. It held its position with the absolute stillness of something that was not concerned about being seen, because being seen was not the problem. The problem, I understood on some level, that was functioning faster than my conscious reasoning was being followed, and we were moving in the right direction. I got behind the wheel. Reuben closed the passenger door. I started the truck and put it in drive. The track was about 3/4 of a mile from where we'd been set up to where the property gate met the gravel. I was driving, Reuben in the passenger seat, both of us watching the road. We didn't talk. About halfway to the gate, maybe 400 yards from the property boundary, the truck radio came on. I should explain the radio setup. We run a second band radio in the truck, tuned to the BLM monitoring frequency for whatever district we're working in. So we know if there's any resource management or emergency activity in the area that might affect access or safety. We had been monitoring the San Juan field office frequency for 2 days and had not heard a single transmission. What came through the radio now was not a BLM broadcast, it was my supervisor's voice, Brian. I have worked for Brian for 11 years. He has a specific vocal pattern, a particular quality to the way he ends sentences, a slight hesitation before he states a number or a measurement that I would recognize in a crowd. The voice on the radio had all of it. It said, "Turn around, you need to go back and verify the northeast control point. The data isn't closing." My hand went to the radio handset and then I stopped. The data was closing. I had checked the closure error myself 3 times over the course of the day. It was within tolerance. And Brian had no way to know whether our data was closing or not in real time. We hadn't transmitted any raw data to the office. No connection, no upload. He would be responding to data he did not have in a truck radio that was not connected to any system he would have access to. Reuben was looking at me. He had heard it. I did not key the handset. I kept driving south. The voice came back. Same cadence. Same hesitation. Same everything. "Pull over and call me. Something's wrong with the northeast corner numbers." I looked at the road ahead and kept my speed. The voice came a 3rd time. It started the same way the first 2 had, with Brian's voice, Brian's rhythm, Brian's particular way of beginning a transmission, with a slight intake of breath before the first word. And then, somewhere in the middle of the 3rd sentence, it changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that would make a person say it definitively broke, because it didn't break clean, it fractured. A half-second drop in frequency, a moment where the voice fell below the range of a human throat and then came back up. Like something generating the sound had momentarily slipped below the floor of human vocal production and then corrected. If I had not been listening for exactly that kind of detail, in the way that fieldwork trains a person to listen for anomalies in measurement, I might have attributed it to radio interference. We hit the paved county road. The truck's front tires crossed from gravel to asphalt. The radio went silent, not static. Not to the ambient hiss of an open frequency. Silent, the way a channel goes when the person on the other end releases the transmit button. I have thought a great deal about that moment. I have thought about what it means that the thing on the radio, whatever had been generating Brian's voice with Brian's cadence and Brian's specific vocal rhythms, released the frequency at the exact moment the truck's tires left the gravel and touched the paved road. I have no theory that holds together under examination. What I have is the data point, which is that the county road represented a boundary of some kind, and that whatever had been using that radio to try to turn us around understood the boundary and respected it, or was stopped by it. I can't tell you which of those is true. I'm not sure it matters. We drove back to Gallup without stopping and without speaking much. Reuben had his field book open in his lap the whole way and was writing in it. I didn't ask what he was writing. I knew what he was writing because I was composing the same account in my head, looking for the explanations I would use when I reported this to the firm. I want to tell you about the footsteps now, because I have been working around to this part, and it is the part I have the hardest time with, the part that took the longest to make sense of. When I got back to the motel that evening, after dinner, after a phone call with Brian in which I told him we'd encountered some unexplained phenomena on the site and would be submitting a detailed incident report. I sat down with the GPS data collector and began reviewing the day's position log. The collector records a position stamp every 60 seconds when it's powered on and moving with the operator. It also records when the unit is stationary, logging a hold position with a timestamp. Routine stuff, nothing fancy. I pulled up the log for the south boundary traverse from that morning. At approximately 10:47 in the morning, the log showed my position stationary for 6 consecutive minutes. I remembered that moment. I had stopped on the south line because I heard something behind me, turned around, saw nothing, stood still for a period I estimated at 30 seconds, and then continued. 30 seconds, maybe 45, not 6 minutes. I pulled up the log a second time and read it more carefully. During those 6 minutes of stationary position, the collector had logged a secondary GPS trace. Not mine, not Ruben's. He was 250 feet away and his unit would have produced its own separate log. This was a third trace, appearing in the data as if there had been a second GPS-capable device operating at the same coordinates as mine, offset by approximately 18 inches. It appeared at the start of the 6-minute hold, moved with me when I began walking again, and disappeared from the log at the moment Ruben clicked the radio. I have shown this data to 2 other surveyors I trust, one of whom has a background in geodetic systems and GPS signal processing. Neither of them has a good explanation for a ghost trace appearing in a single unit data log. The most technically coherent suggestion was some form of multipath error, which is a real GPS phenomenon where signals reflect off terrain features and create false position readings. But multipath produces positional scatter, random noise in the position estimate, not a second coherent moving track 18 inches from the primary unit, moving in the same direction at the same speed, stopping when I stopped, and starting again when I started. Multipath doesn't track. Whatever that trace was, it was tracking. The footsteps in the caliche matched mine exactly. Same stride, same depth. I stopped walking. They kept going. I know what I logged. I know what the GPS recorded. I know what Ruben heard when his name was called in his own voice from an empty field. I know what I saw through 8 power binoculars at a quarter mile, and I know what I heard on that truck radio on the 2 tracks south of the property gate. I have no explanation for any of it that survives contact with the physical world I work in every day. I filed a detailed incident report with my firm the following morning. Incident Note 2 in my field book, date and time logged. I included the GPS anomaly data as an attachment. The BLM field office in Farmington received a copy through our standard post-survey documentation process. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a cultural resource specialist at that office. She had a careful, measured way of talking, the kind of tone you develop when your job requires you to discuss things that fall outside the categories most people are comfortable with. She told me that the parcel we had surveyed contained the remnants of a late ancestral Puebloan occupation site, including a partially excavated and documented burial area that had been identified during a reconnaissance survey in 1988. The area appeared in the BLM's archaeological inventory under a site number I won't reproduce here, and it had been flagged as sensitive in the database for decades. Our survey had apparently been initiated without the proper cultural resource clearance, something the development company's team had apparently either missed or not bothered to check. She mentioned, without prompting, that there had been other reports from that parcel over the years. She did not specify what kind of reports or how many. She used the phrase anomalous field conditions and moved on quickly, as if she had used it before in exactly this context and knew from experience that expanding on it wasn't useful. The development project was denied at the federal level several months later. The parcel remains unbuilt. Before she got off the phone, the specialist asked me whether we had observed any unusual animal behavior during the survey, heard any unusual sounds, or experienced any equipment anomalies that were difficult to explain. I told her we'd had some radio interference and some unexplained data in our GPS log. She said, "That's common out there." She said it the way you say something when you mean something else. When you mean, I know exactly what happened to you. I've heard it before, and I'm not going to put it on record. I think about that call a lot. And I think about the fact that there was already a report from 1988, 31 years before we set foot on that parcel. I think about whoever filed that report and what they put in it, and whether it sounded anything like mine. And I think about the 8-foot offset, the precise, uniform, geometrically intentional repositioning of our control points toward the interior of the property. Not a warning to stay out, a correction. A redrawing of the line we had proposed in the direction that whoever held that land believed the line should be 8 feet of margin. Take your equipment and go. I've taken maybe a dozen jobs in the Four Corners region since that fall. I haven't been back to McKinley County. I don't plan to. Here is what I know. Here is what I can tell you with the confidence of a person who has spent 16 years making precise measurements of physical reality. If you are working land in the Southwest and you encounter evidence of human occupation, work stone, shaped ceramic, burial material, rock art, anything that puts other people in that ground before you, document it and stop. Do not push deeper into the interior of the site. Do not dismiss sounds that stop when you stop moving, because that rhythm is a choice, and choices are made by things that are paying attention. If you hear a voice you recognize coming from a direction where no person could be standing, do not answer it, do not key your radio. Get to the paved road. Whatever is holding that land is not following past the asphalt. I don't know why. I don't need to know why. Get to the pavement and don't go back. Story 2. The development crew was wearing Tyler's hard hat, orange, with the crack along the left side I had been telling him to replace for a month. Tyler was standing right next to me. I want to start with what kind of job this was, because if you understand what kind of job it was, you understand why nobody on my crew was looking for trouble and nobody had any reason to be imagining things. It was a scope trip, a preliminary assessment visit for a residential development project outside Holbrook, Arizona. A Phoenix-based developer had acquired 280 acres of private land in Navajo County, about 9 miles east of Holbrook and roughly 3 miles from the southern boundary of the Petrified Forest National Park. The land sat at around 5,400 feet, high desert terrain, mostly open scrub with some juniper and a few dry arroyos cutting through the property from northeast to southwest. The developer wanted a crew on the ground to walk the site and establish what kind of earthwork they were dealing with before they committed to the full design phase. How much cut and fill, where the natural drainage was running, whether the soil conditions were going to require anything special in the foundation approach. I had been doing site assessment and grading work in Arizona and New Mexico for almost 14 years. Before that, I spent 5 years in California doing similar work in the Central Valley and along the coast. I have assessed hundreds of sites in the Southwest. I know what ordinary looks like, and I know what a problem looks like. And when I drove out to that parcel on a Monday in late September with my 2-man crew, nothing about the preliminary materials the developer had sent us suggested we would be anything other than done by Wednesday afternoon. My crew on that job was Tyler Marsh and a man named Garrett Flores. Tyler had been working with me for 3 years and knew earthwork the way some people know a language, instinctively, without having to think about the grammar of it. He was 26, big through the shoulders, not a talker, good with a level and good with numbers. Garrett was newer, about a year with the company, solid and reliable, but still building the kind of experience that only comes from time in the field. He had grown up in Show Low, which meant he knew the high desert the way you know it when you grew up in it, rather than the way you know it from a map. Garrett was the kind of person who noticed things. On a job site, that quality is useful. On the kind of job this turned into, it was something else. We drove out from Holbrook in 2 trucks, Tyler riding with me and Garrett following, and reached the property access gate at a few minutes before 7 in the morning. The developer's contact had left the combination with me in an email. The gate was a standard ranch-style aluminum frame, padlocked, with a no trespassing sign that the developer's team had supplemented with a handwritten note on laminated cardboard saying, "Authorized personnel only, assessment in progress." We were authorized. We went through. The access road was about a mile of decomposed granite 2-track that connected the gate to the approximate center of the property. We drove it slowly, the truck rocking over the ruts that summer monsoon runoff had cut across the track. The land on either side was open enough that you could see a long way in any direction. The terrain was gently rolling, not flat but not dramatic, the kind of landscape that real estate brochures call expansive views when they're being generous. In September, after the monsoon season, the scrub was as green as it gets in that country, which still isn't very green. Some annual grasses along the arroyo margins, the juniper looking dark and dense, a few desert willows in the wetter spots near the channel bottoms. On the drive in that first morning, Garrett tapped his horn twice, which was how we signaled to stop and look at something from the second truck. I pulled over. He came up alongside and pointed east, toward a section of the arroyo bank about 50 yards off the access road. I looked where he was pointing and saw it after a moment, a stretch of the bank where the exposed soil profile was layered in a way that caught the morning light differently from the surrounding material. Darker in one band, lighter above and below. He said it looked like burn ash. I told him it was probably just a natural soil variation, and we kept moving. I thought about that observation later, after we found the stone feature. The burn layer in the bank profile and the concentration of organic soil in the northeast depression were consistent with an occupation site. I should have connected them earlier. I didn't. He parked at a wide spot in the track and walked the site through the morning. Tyler worked the southeast quadrant with the laser level and the rod, while Garrett and I ran the main arroyo crossing to establish how much water it was moving during storm events. The answer, based on the channel cross-section and the high water marks on the bank vegetation, was quite a lot, more than the preliminary topo suggested. I noted it. We would need to reroute the main access further north or design a properly engineered crossing. The developer wasn't going to love that conversation, but it was the kind of information a scope trip exists to surface. By noon we had covered the southern 2/3 of the parcel. We broke for lunch at the trucks, ate in the shade of the open tailgate, drank water, and talked through what we'd found. The main drainage concern, the soil conditions in the south section, better than the preliminary topo had suggested in some areas, worse in others, as it usually is when you actually put boots on the ground rather than reading a map. Normal job talk. Garrett mentioned, while we were eating, that the property had an unusual amount of bird activity toward the northeast. He had been watching ravens, 3 of them, making low, slow passes over the northeast section since we had arrived that morning. Ravens in the high desert are common. Ravens making deliberate, repetitive passes over a specific area and then landing in the surrounding juniper and sitting there watching you are a different thing. I had noticed them too, but had not said anything. Garrett noted that they seemed to be focused on a particular spot rather than ranging across the whole property. Tyler said ravens could smell decomposition through several feet of soil, that they were smart enough to track a carcass underground. I told him he was probably thinking of turkey vultures. He said he was pretty sure ravens had the same ability and that we could look it up later. We didn't look it up later, because by the time later arrived, we had other things on our minds. I thought about the ravens that night in the motel. I thought about the specific area they were circling. I thought about what was directly below that area. I am not a superstitious person, and I was not about to tell my crew that the birds were circling the northeast depression for spiritual reasons. But I also could not find an entirely satisfying material explanation for 3 ravens making passes over a 50-yard area with the kind of focused, repetitive attention that birds of that intelligence reserve for things that are worth their focus. The afternoon plan was to walk the northern section, which the topo showed as slightly more varied terrain with a second arroyo system draining the northeast corner. Nothing in any of the preliminary materials we had said anything about that northeast corner being unusual in any way. When we reached it on foot, about an hour into the afternoon work, what I noticed first was the change in the soil. Not dramatic, not a hard line, but a transition, moving from the sandy clay loam we had been walking on all morning to something darker, richer, almost black in color. A concentrated organic layer that sat in a roughly circular area maybe 50 yards across, centered on a slight depression in the terrain. The vegetation was different there too. Denser, darker green, even in late September. The kind of concentrated growth you sometimes see where water collects or where the soil chemistry is different from the surrounding area. I have been to enough ancestral sites over the course of 14 years in the Southwest to recognize that vegetation response. Organic material from human habitation changes the soil chemistry. Plants respond to it centuries after the habitation ends. You can sometimes read the footprint of an old occupation from above, from a drone or a satellite, just by watching where the vegetation is denser, darker, better fed than the surrounding land. Standing at the edge of that depression, I could read it from ground level, and in the depression itself, half buried by accumulated wind-blown soil, were flat stones, many of them arranged in a way that was not random, concentric arcs, like the outer rings of something that had once been a more complete structure, worn down to almost nothing by centuries of wind and water, but still faintly readable if you knew what to look for. I had seen similar features on other sites in the region, the foundation ghost of a pit house, a kiva outline, the remnant wall of a storage structure, the soil disturbance associated with the organic layer, the stone arrangements, the hydrology. They all pointed to the same conclusion. Something had been built here, people had lived here, and, given the form of what remained, they had probably buried their dead here as well. I had Garrett hold position at the edge of the depression while I walked the perimeter of the feature, taking photographs, logging GPS waypoints, staying on the perimeter rather than entering the depression itself, standard practice on any site with potential burial significance and good sense besides. The stone arcs were visible above the accumulated soil, showed careful placement. The stones had been selected for flatness and uniformity and set with their edges in contact. Not a casual pile, not scattered. A structure, the remnant of a wall or a series of walls that had once been substantial enough that 800 years of desert weather hadn't been able to completely erase its geometry. I told Tyler and Garrett we were pulling back from the northeast section and running the rest of the afternoon assessment along the northern boundary without going back in. Garrett asked why. I said I wanted to check the SPO database before we walked any further in that area, which was true. SPO is the State Historic Preservation Office. Any site with potential archaeological significance in Arizona requires coordination with that office before you start moving soil. The developer had not mentioned any such coordination in the materials he sent us. That was their problem, and it was about to become a bigger one. What I didn't tell Tyler and Garrett was the other thing I had noticed at the perimeter of the depression, on the northwest side, where the stone arcs were closest to the surface and most readable. Pressed into the soil between two flat stones, at a depth that suggested it had been there for some time but had not been there for centuries, was a boot print. Recent. The tread pattern still clear. A work boot, large, maybe a size 12 or 13. The print was deep, which meant whoever made it had been standing there with the full weight of their body on that foot, not moving through, not stepping across. Standing, facing into the depression. I photographed it and did not mention it to my crew. I didn't want to spend the rest of the day explaining why a boot print in a remote field was giving me the feeling it was giving me. I filed it in my own memory and kept moving. We worked the northern boundary line through the rest of the afternoon, and were back at the trucks by 5:30. I photographed the stone feature from the edge of the depression, logged the GPS coordinates, and added it to my assessment notes. We drove back to Holbrook, ate at a restaurant near the motel, and I spent the evening writing up preliminary notes on my laptop and looking up the parcel in the SPO and BLM databases. The databases showed nothing recorded for the specific parcel coordinates. That didn't mean nothing was there. It meant nothing had been formally identified and recorded yet. An absence of a record is not an absence of significance. We were back on site the following morning at 6:45. We found what we found at the trucks first, before we had gone anywhere. The previous day we had left our equipment staged near the trucks, grade stakes bundled and standing upright against the rear of the bed, marking flags in their wire holder on the tailgate, the laser level case closed and latched on the seat. Standard end-of-day staging. When we arrived that morning, the grade stakes were gone. Not lying on the ground near the trucks, not scattered by wind. Gone. Every one of them, probably 40 in total, pulled from the bundle and removed from the site. The wire flag holder was still on the tailgate. The flags were still in it. Only the stakes. I stood at the back of the truck for a moment, trying to work out what combination of circumstances could produce this outcome without requiring anything unusual. Theft was possible, but thieves don't carry off 40 survey stakes and leave the flag holder they were sitting next to. Wind was not possible. The stakes were heavy gauge steel, bundled with wire, standing in a corner of the truck bed. There was no mechanism. Tyler walked around both trucks looking for them. Garrett checked the surrounding scrub, thinking maybe something had moved them. I knew they weren't in the scrub. I knew they weren't anywhere on the property. Whatever had come through that clearing while we were in Holbrook had taken them, and that was the end of it. Then Garrett said, "Look at the ground. Around the trucks, in the soft sandy soil of the clearing where we had parked, there should have been our tire tracks from the day before, our boot prints, the compressed areas where we had staged the equipment. The tire tracks were there. Our boot prints from the previous day were there, in a ring around the staging area. But in the center of that ring, overlapping with where we had been standing and where the equipment had been sitting, were marks in the soil that were not boot prints. They were too large to be boot prints. The toe area was elongated beyond what any human foot would produce. Longer, narrower, with a depth distribution suggesting the weight was concentrated differently than a human foot concentrates weight during a normal step. The spacing between successive marks was wider than any stride a person my height could achieve, closer to 5 feet between each placement, which would require legs that no human body has in its normal configuration. The depth was wrong too. Our boot prints from the previous day had compressed the soil maybe a quarter of an inch. These marks were pressed in nearly an inch on soil of the same type and condition, suggesting a weight well beyond what a person of any reasonable size would carry. I photographed everything methodically. The marks, the truck positions, the absent space where the stakes should have been. Garrett crouched and put his hand next to one of the marks for scale, and I photographed that too. His hand, which is not a small hand, looked the way a child's hand looks when you place it next to an adult's. The marks were that much larger. I counted 14 distinct impressions. They entered the clearing from the north, circled the truck staging area in 2 complete loops, and exited back to the north. Whatever made them had been thorough in its inspection. It had walked the perimeter of our camp twice. We did not discuss what made them. We got to work. By mid-morning we were running the west boundary line, finishing the traverse data we needed before I could submit the preliminary report. Tyler was 200 feet ahead of me with the rod. Garrett was behind me, logging elevations. The temperature was around 65 degrees. The sky was cloudless. A perfect working morning by every external measure. The figure appeared on the ridge at the northeast corner of the property. It appeared in the sense that one moment the ridge was empty against the blue sky, and the next moment it wasn't. I did not see it approach. I did not see it crest the ridge. I looked up from my notes, and it was standing there. Dark clothing, long coat, or something similar. Tall enough that it read clearly against the sky, even at a distance. I estimated at maybe 350 yards. Not moving. I watched it for a moment, then went back to my notes. People hike through open country all the time. The property was posted, but the posting was recent. Someone might not have seen the signs. I kept working for another 5 or 6 minutes. Logged 2 elevation readings. Noted a drainage swale that wasn't on the topo. Adjusted my traverse line to account for a juniper stand that would need to be cleared. Standard work. When I looked up again, the figure was still on the ridge. Same position. Still not moving. At 350 yards in September morning light, a stationary person reads as a dark shape against the sky. You cannot see facial features. You cannot read body language in any meaningful detail. What you can see, if you're paying attention, is the general orientation of the figure and whether it is doing things that a person standing on a ridge looking at an interesting landscape would normally do. A person on a ridge turns. A person on a ridge shifts their weight. A person on a ridge raises a hand to shade their eyes or pulls out a phone or does any number of small, restless things that people do when they are standing somewhere and looking at something. This figure did none of those things. For the entire time I observed it with the naked eye, it held its position with the complete stillness of something that was not watching scenery. Tyler's radio clicked twice. I looked up. He was staring at the ridge. I clicked back and walked to him. When I reached him, he had his hand raised, the rod balanced against his shoulder, watching the figure on the ridge with a fixed, flat expression that I had not seen on his face before. In 3 years of working together, he said it had been moving. I asked what he meant. He said he had been watching it for about 5 minutes before he clicked the radio. He said during that time it had moved from its original position at the crest of the ridge to a new position about 40 yards east along the ridgeline, but he had never seen it move. He had looked down at the rod to check the reading, looked back up, and it was in a different position. He had been watching carefully since then, and it hadn't moved again. I got the binoculars. At that distance, with that magnification, I could resolve the figure well enough to see what I needed to see. The first thing I saw was the clothing. A heavy coat, dark, possibly black. The fabric had a weight to it that didn't quite track with the temperature. It was in the mid-60s, and the figure was dressed for weather much colder than that. The second thing was the height. The figure was tall, noticeably tall even at 350 yards against a ridge with no reference objects. I estimated it at roughly 6.5 to 7 feet, which I arrived at by comparing its apparent height against the juniper cluster about 20 feet to its east that I had walked past earlier in the day and knew to be approximately 8 feet high. The third thing I saw was the way it was standing. The weight was wrong. The distribution of mass across the figure's posture was consistent with something that was not accustomed to a standing position, like something that ordinarily moved on 4 limbs and was making a deliberate effort to occupy 2. The shoulders sat too high, almost hunched up toward the ears, rather than relax and drop the way a person's shoulders sit when they are standing at rest. The neck was too far forward, the head projecting ahead of the center line of the torso rather than above it. The arms, hanging at the sides, had a quality to them that I found myself trying to explain away for several seconds before I stopped trying. There seemed to be an additional articulation below the standard elbow, a third bend in the arm below the forearm that angled the hands inward toward the body in a way no human arm does naturally. I had been looking through the binoculars for maybe 20 seconds when the figure turned its head, slowly, deliberately, the kind of turn that communicates awareness rather than casual interest. It turned until whatever served as its face was directed at the binoculars, at the point in the landscape where I was standing with the glass to my eyes. It knew exactly where I was. It had known the whole time. I lowered the binoculars. I told Tyler and Garrett we were done for the day. Not for the morning, for the day. We were packing up and leaving. Tyler didn't argue. He had seen enough through the naked eye that he wasn't going to give me any resistance. Garrett started to ask something and then stopped, which meant he had looked at my face and decided the question could wait. We packed. I moved faster than I normally move on a job. Equipment cases latched, tool bags loaded, nothing left staged at the site. 6 minutes, maybe 7, from the moment I said we were leaving to the moment I had the truck in gear. I was backing out of the clearing when Garrett, in the back seat, said my name in a voice that had no inflection in it at all. I stopped the truck, he said. That's Tyler's hard hat. I looked where he was pointing, at the edge of the clearing, where the scrub began to thicken toward the north, the same direction those ground marks had entered and exited from. A figure was standing in the shadow of a juniper cluster. Not on the ridge. not at the northeast corner of the property. In the clearing at the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the back of my truck, it was wearing Tyler's hard hat, orange, with a crack along the left side that I had been telling him to replace for a month. The crack ran diagonally from the left front vent downward, about 3 inches. I had pointed to that crack 4 times in 3 weeks. It was specific, identifiable, not something you could confuse with a different hard hat. The figure was wearing it pulled low, the way you wear a hard hat when you're trying to keep the sun out of your eyes, and it was standing with the stillness of something that had been there long enough that it had decided to stop pretending to be casual about it. It wasn't pretending anything. It was standing at the boundary where the clearing met the scrub, and it was looking at the truck. Tyler was in the passenger seat next to me. His hard hat was on his head. I need you to understand what I mean by that. Tyler was sitting in the cab of the truck, 3 feet from me, with his orange hard hat on his head, the one with the crack along the left side. And the figure at the tree line was wearing an identical hard hat with an identical crack in an identical position. Tyler looked at his own hard hat, and then at the figure, and then back at his hard hat. He pulled the hard hat off his head and held it in his lap and looked at the crack and looked at the figure and did not say anything for what felt like a very long time. When he spoke, it was very quietly. That's not possible. He was right. It was not possible. The only explanation I have ever been able to arrive at, and I have thought about it many times, is that the thing at the tree line had been watching us closely enough and long enough to replicate what it saw Tyler wearing with a precision that was not accidental. It was not wearing a hard hat it had found. It was demonstrating to us, specifically and deliberately, what it had been doing while we worked. It had been close enough to read the crack on the left side of a hard hat, and it wanted us to know that the figure was not moving. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, at the exact line where the clearing's open ground met the denser scrub, and it was not crossing that line, not toward the truck. I noticed that. It was at the boundary. I did not know what the boundary meant to it, but it was observing it. I put the truck in drive and did not look at the figure again. We reached the gate in under 2 minutes, at a speed that was probably not appropriate for the quality of the 2-track road. Every rut and rock the truck hit on the way out I felt in my spine, and I didn't slow down. Tyler had his hard hat in his lap the whole drive to the gate, and was looking at the crack along the left side with an expression I had no category for. Not fear, something beyond fear, on the far side of it, where a person goes when fear has finished doing what it can. I got out, unlocked the gate, drove through, and relocked the padlock. I stood at the gate for a moment after relocking it and looked back down the 2-track toward the clearing. Empty. The scrub on either side. Still. No movement in the juniper at the tree line where the figure had been standing. Whatever it was, it had not followed us to the gate. I want to be precise about that boundary, because I have thought about it since. The clearing sat at the end of the 2-track, about a mile from the gate. The figure had been standing at the edge of the clearing, at the line where the open ground gave way to the scrub. It was at a boundary. Not the property boundary, not any line on a legal document, but some other kind of line that it seemed to recognize as the edge of its ground. The clearing was within that ground. The gate apparently was not, or the road to the gate was not. Something about the transition between that clearing and the mile of 2-track, between it and the county road, represented a limit that the figure respected or was constrained by, in the same way we had been constrained by the locked gate on the way in. I got back in the truck. We drove to Holbrook. When I looked back through the rear window at the gate as we pulled onto the county road, the clearing at the far end of the 2-track was empty against the sky. I counted that as a good outcome. We drove back to Holbrook without speaking for most of the drive. Garrett sat in the back seat, looking out the window at the desert going past. Tyler held his hard hat in his lap the whole way. About halfway back to town, Tyler said, "How long do you think it was watching us?" I did not have a good answer to that. Based on the ground marks in the clearing, it had been there the night before while we were in Holbrook. Based on the boot print I had found at the Northeast Depression the afternoon before, the one I had not mentioned to either of them, it may have been watching since the first day we were on the property. I did not tell Tyler either of those things. I told him I didn't know. That was mostly true. We drove back to Holbrook. I called the developer's acquisitions contact from the motel parking lot. I told him our assessment had identified a potential cultural resource concern in the northeast quadrant that required coordination with SHPO before any further site work could proceed. I told him we had documented the concern in our preliminary report and would submit our full findings within the week. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We were told there was nothing out there." I said I understood that, and I told him the documentation I had from the site told a different story, and the conversation was going to need to be a formal one involving the State Preservation Office and potentially the Bureau of Indian Affairs, if the feature turned out to be as significant as I believed it was. He said he would call me back. He did not call me back. I submitted our preliminary report to the state office and to the BLM field office in Winslow the following week. I labeled it Incident Assessment Report 1 in my project file and included all photographs, GPS logs, and field notes. I included the photographs of the ground marks in the clearing, the stone feature, the burn layer in the Arroyo Bank profile, and the boot print I had found at the edge of the stone depression. I did not include any speculative interpretation of the figure we had observed. I listed it as an unidentified person observed on the property and noted its location and description in factual terms. Unidentified person, approximately 6 to 7 feet tall, dark clothing, observed at northeast ridgeline and later at clearing treeline during the afternoon assessment of day 2. The photographs from the binoculars did not come out in any useful way at that magnification. Through a handheld lens rather than a mounted camera, the image was blurred enough to show only a dark shape against the sky, which was probably just as well. 4 months later, the development project was withdrawn. I received a form letter from the developer's legal team advising that the project had been canceled due to changed market conditions. I noted the timing. 4 months after our site assessment, 3 months after our preliminary report went to the state office, and said nothing about it to anyone. A tribal historic preservation officer I had spoken with during the SHPO review process called me a week after that. She had been part of the consultation process on the site and had reviewed our report in detail. She told me, without going into specifics, that the feature in the northeast quadrant was consistent with an ancestral site of significance to 2 different tribal nations, and that the area had a history of documented anomalous activity reports going back several decades, people feeling observed, equipment moved without explanation, people hearing their names from locations where no one was present, that the stone feature in the depression was almost certainly associated with a burial area, and that the land had been considered protected, informally but seriously, by the communities with historical ties to it for a very long time. I asked her what kind of thing was known to be responsible for the reported activity. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said the specific word for it was not something she was going to use on the phone. She said the important thing was that it was territorial, that it guarded specific ground, that it did not pursue people beyond the boundary of what it considered its territory, and that the most important thing any person could do on encountering it was not to give it a reason to treat them as a threat, rather than a trespasser. Trespassers, she said. It warns. Threats, it handles differently. I asked her how a person ends up being treated as a threat rather than a trespasser. She said, by coming back. Tyler replaced his hard hat the week after we got back from Holbrook. He bought a new one, a different brand, a different shade of orange. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. 3 years on the job, and I have never once heard him bring up what he saw in that clearing. Garrett stayed with the company for another 8 months, and then took a position in the valley where the work was strictly urban infill. No rural sites, no open desert. He didn't say that was why he left, but I knew. I have not assessed a site in Navajo County since that September. That may change. I hope it doesn't. Here is what I'll tell you plainly, because it's the most useful thing I can offer. If you are doing field work in the high desert and you find stone arrangements, organic soil concentration, or any material that suggests the ground has been used for burial or ceremony, document it and do not go deeper into the site. Do not stage equipment near the feature. Do not return to a site where your equipment has been moved overnight without first understanding what moved it. And if you see something at the edge of a clearing wearing a piece of gear that belongs to the person standing next to you, do not try to understand it. Do not wait. The boundary of the clearing is the boundary of your safety, and what stands at that boundary is telling you, very clearly, that you have already been closer to it than it wanted you to be. Get to the gate. Don't go back. Story 3. The mail Rudy had 11 minutes before the sun hit the ridge. I knew, the way you know something, without knowing how, that I could not still be on that road when it did. I want to tell you something about rural mail routes in the high desert before I get into the specifics of what happened, because I think it matters for understanding what kind of situation we were in and why the decisions we made were the ones we made. A rural route in a place like White Pine County, Nevada is not like a city route. There is no grid, there is no logical sequence of addresses that loops neatly back to the post office at the end of the day. A rural route is a long linear thing, sometimes 100 miles of road for 120 mailboxes, some of them clustered near small ranch properties, and some of them standing alone in the middle of nowhere, servicing a house you cannot see from the road. The road itself changes character as you go. Paved state highway to maintained county gravel to unmaintained county gravel to private road that the county stopped maintaining 30 years ago but still officially owns. You learn where the road quality changes. You learn which ranch dogs will come at the truck and which ones are just performing. You learn the rhythm of the route the way you learn any long, repetitive thing, not as a sequence of conscious decisions, but as a body memory, a set of instincts that fire correctly without requiring thought. I had been running routes out of the Ely, Nevada post office for 9 years. I was not new to this. In 9 years, you accumulate a working knowledge of the high desert that is hard to articulate because most of it lives in your hands and your eyes rather than in any place you can point to. You know which washes run during monsoon and which ones are dry even in a wet year. You know which ranch dogs mean it and which ones are performing. You know which stretches of road go soft in spring thaw and which ones hold their surface year-round. You know the light, how it changes through the day, how the afternoon sun makes the basalt glow amber and turns the sagebrush silver, how the early morning light in March is thin and hard and reveals things the fuller midday light hides. You know the quiet, and you know the difference between the quiet of a normal empty stretch of desert and a quiet that feels like an absence rather than a default. I had felt that second kind of quiet before on certain stretches of certain routes. I had not had language for it. After what happened on the rerouted section, I stopped looking for better language. I know what it is. The route I was covering that Tuesday in early March was not my regular route. My regular route runs north out of Ely toward McGill and then loops east. The route I was covering temporarily as a fill-in for a carrier named Phil who had taken emergency family leave ran southeast out of Ely on State Route 318, then turned onto an unnamed county road that meandered through the high desert for about 30 miles before looping back 42 mailboxes. Phil had been running it for 6 years and knew it cold. I was covering it blind, which meant I had his route book and a lot of attention to spare for the details. The route had been rerouted about 3 months before Phil went on leave. The original route had used a different secondary road, one that connected the state highway to the county gravel more directly. That road had been closed due to a washout from the previous summer's monsoon season, and the reroute took the route about 8 miles further south before connecting back to the county road, through a stretch of BLM land that the original route had bypassed entirely. The reroute was temporary, officially. The repair timeline on the washed-out road was uncertain. In Nevada terms, uncertain means you shouldn't hold your breath. I was covering the route alone that Tuesday, which is the standard arrangement. Rural routes in White Pine County run solo, but I had a rider along for the day. A new hire named Owen, in his second week with the service, doing route familiarization. Owen was 22, from Elko, quiet and observant in the way of people who grew up driving long stretches of Nevada road where there is nothing to do but pay attention. He sat in the passenger seat with the route book open in his lap and asked good questions about sequencing the sorting tray, about outgoing mail protocol at gated properties, about what to log when a box is damaged. Practical questions. He was the kind of person who noticed things without needing to announce that he had noticed them, which made him good company and meant that when he did say something out loud, it was worth listening to. We left the post office at 10 past 8 in the morning. The weather was good, clear sky, temperature around 32 degrees at departure, warming slowly. The high desert in early March is still winter, but it's a dry cold that feels workable when the sun is up. Snow on the higher ridges to the west, nothing on the flats. The sagebrush along Route 318 was pale gray-green. The road surface good, no ice. In normal morning. We ran the first 18 stops on the state highway and the early county road section without anything worth mentioning. Ranches, a BLM access road box for a grazing permit holder who received the same quarterly range management correspondence regardless of season. A cluster of 3 mailboxes at a junction serving a family spread across 2 adjacent properties. Owen watched me work and made notes in his own notebook alongside Phil's route book, which I appreciated. The new hires who take notes are the ones who become good at this. The ones who assume they will remember are the ones calling you with questions on their first solo run. By the time we crossed from the county gravel onto the rerouted BLM section, Owen had a reasonable sense of the rhythm. Pull up, swap out going for inbound, note anything unusual, move. The work is repetitive by design, and repetition is what makes a long rural route manageable. It is also what makes an anomaly stand out. When you have done the same physical sequence for 22 consecutive stops, the 23rd stop, that is different registers, before you have consciously identified what is different about it. The rerouted section began at a cattle guard about 22 miles into the route. The road surface changed at that point, from the county-maintained gravel that had been solid all morning to a softer, dustier track that had not been graded recently. The BLM land on either side of the track was open sagebrush flat, broken here and there by low basalt ridges and dry washes. The kind of terrain that extends in every direction to the horizon and gives you no reference for scale. A ridgeline that looks close turns out to be 5 miles away. A wash that looks shallow turns out to be 10 feet deep at the bank. I had driven through sections of BLM land many times on various routes over 9 years. They all have a common quality of open, uncurated emptiness. Nothing has been graded or planted or maintained. Everything grows and erodes at its own pace. The land looks the same as it probably looked several hundred years ago, except for the track itself. That quality is generally peaceful. The rerouted section had it, but underneath it, from the first quarter mile past the cattle guard, was that other quality I mentioned. The active absence quiet, the quiet that has an orientation. Owen noticed it too, though he did not say so until later. What he said, when we were about a mile into the BLM section, was, "Does it feel like something is watching us out here?" He said it the way young people say things they mean seriously, but want the option to retract. I told him the open desert could feel that way sometimes. He nodded and looked out the window. We both knew that was not really what either of us meant. I noticed the petroglyphs about a mile into the rerouted section. They were on a basalt outcrop to the east of the road, maybe 30 yards off the track, a low shelf of dark volcanic rock with a south-facing face that had caught sun and human attention for a long time. Even From the road I could see the marks. Spirals, mostly, and what looked like animal figures. Deer or pronghorn. I thought, though, at 30 yards the rendering was abstract enough that I was interpreting more than reading. Some of the marks were high on the face of the rock in a way that suggested the ground level had been different when they were made, the accumulated soil of centuries having raised the base and buried whatever signs had once been at the bottom of the panel. Old. Very old. I slowed the truck down to look. Owen looked too, and said he had driven past a lot of BLM land in Nevada and never noticed anything like that before. I told him that was because most people weren't looking at the right angle at the right time of day. The marks were easiest to read in raking light, morning or late afternoon, when the shadows in the carved grooves were deep and the contrast between the worked surface and the unworked stone was clearest. At midday they practically disappeared. We were looking at them in morning light, which was why we could see them clearly. What I also noticed, after a moment, was that the track we were on passed within about 50 feet of the base of the outcrop at its closest point. The original route had bypassed this section entirely, running 8 miles to the north. The reroute had brought commercial vehicle traffic directly past the site, 3 times a week since the closure, back and forth. I did not know who had approved the reroute, or whether anyone had assessed the cultural resource implications of running a postal vehicle repeatedly past a documented petroglyph site. I suspected no one had. I noted the outcrop's position in the route book margin and kept moving. 24 stops left. The rerouted section had a quality to it that I noticed but could not immediately name. The sagebrush on either side of the track was the same species as everywhere else on the route. The basalt ridges were geologically identical to the ones visible to the north and east. The sky was the same sky. But the quality of attention on that stretch of road felt different. The kind of different where you find yourself checking your mirrors more often than usual without knowing why, or where you find yourself listening to the ambient sound of the truck's engine with unusual attention because part of you is listening for something underneath it. I want to be precise about that because I know how it sounds. I am not a superstitious person, and I was not in an elevated state of mind. I had been running desert routes for 9 years. I knew what the road felt like when it was normal, and I knew what it felt like when something was off. The rerouted section felt off from about a mile past the petroglyph outcrop, not dramatically, just enough that the back of my neck was making its opinion known in a way I hadn't requested. I noted it. I kept working. The first wrong thing happened at stop 26. Stop 26 on Phil's route book was a standard rural mailbox, a black metal box on a wooden post, positioned at the turnoff to a ranch road leading to a property I couldn't see from the track. Name on the box, R. Paulos. Outgoing mail in the box when I pulled up, a small stack rubber banded together, bills, and what looked like a personal letter. I swapped the outgoing for the inbound, which was 2 pieces, a utility bill and a seed catalog, and pulled forward. 40 yards further along the track was a second mailbox. This should not have been there. I had Phil's route book open on the seat and had been running the stops in sequence all morning. Stop 27 was 3/10 of a mile further along the road. Stop 26 and stop 27 were not adjacent. There was nothing at that position in the book. The box was a pale gray metal post and box unit, the older style the Postal Service had used on rural routes in the 80s and 90s. Narrower than the current standard. The paint was faded to almost white on the south face, where decades of sun had worked on it. No name or number on the side. The red flag was raised, indicating outgoing mail. I stopped the truck. Owen looked at the box. I looked at the route book. Nothing at that position. Is that on the route? Owen asked. I told him it wasn't listed. I told him it could be a legacy box from a property that had been removed from the route at some point, which happens Phil would know the history of it. I reached out the window and opened the box. It was empty. No outgoing mail, no ingoing residue, no junk mail or forwarding slips from previous service. The interior was clean and dry and had the faint, closed space smell of a container that had been sealed for a long time. The flag was up, the box was empty. The flag had been up before we arrived. I closed the flag, closed the box, and sat for a moment looking at it. Owen was quiet. Then I put the truck in gear and drove past. About a mile further along the rerouted track, at a point where the road curved gently around a low basalt ridge, I saw a figure standing beside the road. A person, standing still, facing the road, as if waiting for the truck to arrive. I slowed before I reached them. In rural route work, a person standing roadside in the middle of nowhere is usually someone with a vehicle problem or someone trying to catch a carrier for a package intercept. Both are normal occurrences. Normal enough that I was not alarmed, just watchful. The figure was wearing a postal service uniform, not the current issue. The older style from before the uniform change that went into effect about 15 years back. The darker navy jacket with the matching slacks and the older USPS eagle patch on the left shoulder, the one with the different font on the lettering, the kind of uniform that carriers who had been with the service for a long time sometimes still wore, because the service lets you run out old stock rather than requiring immediate replacement. The matching cap was pulled low, the person's hands were in the jacket pockets. I rolled down the window and asked if they needed assistance. They did not respond immediately. A pause long enough to be noticeable. Then they raised one hand from the pocket and pointed down the road ahead, further along the rerouted track, further into the BLM land. I asked again. Owen said, quietly, "That's Phil's jacket." I looked at him. He was watching the figure through the windshield. He said, "The patch on the shoulder. Phil still wears the old jacket sometimes." That specific patch, the one with the old lettering. He had it on last week, in the office. I looked at the figure. The patch on the left shoulder was the older style. Phil had worked for the Postal Service long enough to have the old uniform. Owen had seen it on him the prior week. Phil was on family leave in Reno, 300 miles from where we were sitting. I rolled the window up and drove past. In the passenger side mirror, I watched the figure behind us. It did not turn to watch the truck go. It was still facing down the road ahead, in the direction it had been pointing, as if the truck had not passed it at all. At stop 27, I got out to deliver a package that wouldn't fit in the box. I kept it brief, package in the box, door closed, back to the truck in under 30 seconds. When I climbed back in, Owen was looking out the passenger side window at a point about 50 yards behind us on the road. He said, "That person is behind us again." I looked in the passenger mirror. The figure in the old postal jacket was standing on the road behind the truck at a distance of roughly 50 yards, facing the truck, hands in the jacket pockets, standing still. I had driven 3/10 of a mile since passing it at the basalt ridge. It had covered that distance in the time it took me to deliver a package and walk 15 feet back to the truck. There was no vehicle visible anywhere on the road behind us. No dust cloud from a truck or ATV that might have passed while I was at the mailbox. Nothing. I thought about what I was seeing and applied the only reasonable framework I had available, which was, there is a person on this road who is behaving in a way that makes no sense given the information I have, and I should treat that as a safety concern without necessarily theorizing about what it means. I told Owen to watch the road behind us and let me know if it moved. He said he would. At stop 28, a cluster of 3 boxes at a junction, the figure was already there when we arrived. It was standing between the second and third box when I pulled up. Not approaching, not doing anything. Standing at the edge of the road with its hands in the jacket pockets and its face in the shadow of the cap brim facing the truck. This was not possible given the distance it would have had to cover while I was driving from the previous stop. I had been watching the road ahead and had not seen it until we were within 30 yards of the junction. It had not been visible from further back on the straight track approaching the junction. It was simply there. I serviced the first box from the driver's window without getting out, reached as far as I could for the second, had to open the door for the third. When I opened the door, the figure was about 15 yards away on the far side of the junction marker, close enough that I could see the detail of the jacket without binoculars, close enough to read the old eagle patch on the shoulder close enough to see the cap brim and the shadow it cast and the face in that shadow, which I looked at for about 2 seconds before I stopped looking at it. I will describe what I saw in those 2 seconds as accurately as I can. The face in the shadow of the cap was not the face of any person I recognized. It was also not quite the face of a person. The proportions were slightly wrong, not dramatically, not in a way that would read clearly on a photograph, but in the specific way of something that had assembled the components of a human face, from memory rather than from the inside. Eyes set a little too far apart, or a little too close together. I could not fix which, and looking longer would not have helped. The nose too long, or the mouth too low. The kind of wrongness that your eyes try to correct for that makes you look twice and then wish you hadn't. I dropped the third package in the box without fully registering the motion. I was back in the truck in under 5 seconds. Owen said nothing. He was looking straight ahead through the windshield. I told him we were going to run the remaining stops as fast as safely possible and then get off the rerouted section. He said, "How many left?" 14. The sun was getting low, past 4 in the afternoon, the march light going flat and directional, the shadows stretching. The temperature had dropped back below freezing, and the sky had taken on the pale, drained quality that precedes a desert sunset in early spring. We were far enough into the rerouted section that the petroglyph outcrop was behind us, and the county road junction was ahead, though not close enough for comfort. The figure appeared ahead of us at each of the next 6 stops before we arrived. At each junction, each mailbox cluster, each pullout, when we came around a bend or crested a small rise to see the next stop, it was already there. Same distance back from the box, same posture, same pointing gesture when I looked at it, directing us further along the route in the direction we were already traveling. I could not tell whether the pointing was meant to hurry us or to direct us somewhere specific or to communicate something that had no translation into any language I spoke. I kept moving. What I noticed working through those 6 stops was that it was not getting closer. It was maintaining its distance, always the same 40 to 50 yards, whether we had just passed it or had come to a new stop and found it waiting. It was not herding us towards something. It was, I began to think, escorting us, keeping pace, making itself visible, making sure we knew it was there and knew we were being watched through every minute we spent on that ground. At stop 34, it stood in the road ahead of the truck rather than beside it. I slowed to a stop about 30 yards back. The figure was crouching in the center of the track. Low, both knees bent, one hand touching the road surface, the way a person crouches when they are examining something on the ground. But it was not examining anything, it was facing us. That posture, low, grounded, both hands near the earth, had the quality of something that had chosen to be very deliberate about the amount of space it was occupying. I sat with the truck idling and looked at it. Owen sat beside me and looked at it. Neither of us said anything for probably 30 seconds. The sun was at the ridge to the west. March sunsets in the high desert move fast once they start. The disk touches the ridge and then drops quickly, and the light changes in a matter of minutes from long, raking amber to flat gray to dark. When the sun is at the ridge, you have maybe 8 minutes of usable driving light before the open desert goes genuinely dark. The clock in the truck read 4:49. The clock also told me something else, which was that we had been on the rerouted section for considerably longer than the stops alone should have taken. We had been running slow, stopping at each junction to service from inside the truck wherever possible, watching the road ahead and behind. The time had accumulated. I did not like what the clock was telling me about how much light we had left. The shadow the figure cast in the late horizontal sun was wrong. Every sagebrush plant on the flats around us was throwing a shadow pointing east, long and thin, stretching away from the sun. The figure's shadow pointed north, perpendicular to everything around it, pointing north from a figure crouching in the road while the sun was due west in the sky. Shadows do not work that way. I noticed it the way you notice a single wrong word in a paragraph you have read many times. The wrongness registers before the specific error is identified. I had 11 minutes before the sun hit the ridge. I knew The way you know something without knowing how, that I could not still be on that road when it did. I put the truck in gear and drove forward. Not fast. A slow, deliberate roll toward the figure in the road. It held its crouch for a long moment, long enough that my foot was hovering over the brake pedal, and Owen was gripping the dashboard with one hand. Then it stood, rose from the crouching position to its full height in a single unhurried motion, not the way a person stands from a crouch, with the forward momentum of the body and the visible effort of the legs, but the way something rises that does not have the same relationship to gravity that we do. It was upright, and it stepped to the side of the road. I drove past at walking speed. In the passenger window, the figure was close enough that Owen could see its face without any ambiguity, and whatever he saw there is something he has not described to me in the years since, and I have not asked him to describe. He sat very still in the passenger seat while we passed it, and he did not look away from it until it was behind us. I accelerated to the fastest speed the road surface safely allowed. The county road junction was visible ahead, the slight grade change where the maintained gravel began, the weathered post marking the junction, and the iron bars of the cattle guard that crossed from the BLM track to the county road. I could see it from about half a mile out in the last of the direct sunlight. It looked like safety. It looked like the specific, particular shape of not having to be on this road anymore. We hit the cattle guard at 4:58. The truck's tires dropped into the gaps between the iron bars, that familiar thunk, 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 and when I looked in the rear-view mirror, the figure was standing at the near edge of the cattle guard. At the iron, it had kept pace with the truck for the final half-mile, or it had appeared at the cattle guard the same way it had appeared at each stop ahead of us, already there, already waiting, standing at the boundary and watching us cross it. It did not cross. I drove the county gravel at a speed I am not proud of, and I did not slow down until the state highway was visible ahead. The highway felt like coming up for air. We did not complete the final 8 stops on the county gravel. We drove straight back to Ely. Owen had his window down for the last 10 minutes of the drive, his elbow on the door, face in the cold air, and I did not ask him why. I told the postmaster that we had encountered an unidentified individual on the BLM section of the rerouted route who had created a safety concern significant enough to warrant cutting the route short. The postmaster asked if we had called it in. I told him we had no cell service on the rerouted section, which was true and is always true out there. He said he would contact the White Pine County Sheriff's Office about the individual and document it as a route safety incident. The Sheriff's Office sent a deputy out the following morning. Deputy found no sign of anyone on the BLM section. He noted the petroglyph outcrop in his report and flagged it for the BLM Range Management Office, asking whether there were any known access concerns in the area. The BLM office responded about 2 weeks later with a brief note saying the outcrop was a documented petroglyph site of cultural significance and that the rerouted mail route was under review as to whether it was appropriate to run commercial traffic through that section of land. The review took 3 months. The route was returned to its original alignment once the washed-out section of road was repaired. Phil came back from family leave about 6 weeks after our incident. I asked him carefully whether he had ever had any unusual experiences on the rerouted section. He looked at me for a moment in the way people look at you when they are deciding whether to say what they actually want to say. Then he said he had not run the rerouted section himself because the reroute had gone into effect about 2 weeks before his leave, and in those 2 weeks he had been filling in at the Ely counter and the fill carrier had been running his route. He had never been on the rerouted section at all. I sat with that information for a while before I thought I understood what it meant. The fill carrier who had run the rerouted section in those 2 weeks before me was a man named Ray, who had since transferred to a station in Fallon. I contacted him and asked if he had seen anything unusual on the BLM stretch. He said he had. Twice. A person standing by the road in what he described as an old postal jacket did not respond when he stopped. He had written it in Phil's route book as a possible homeless individual on the section. I had read that note and not registered what it was describing. So whatever was standing on that road had watched a mail carrier go by at least twice before it watched us. It had been close enough for long enough to form a picture. Not a perfect picture. It had the jacket but not the current one, had the patch but from the wrong era, had the general shape of the uniform but assembled from what it had observed rather than what the service currently issues. Like something building an image from incomplete information, doing its best with what it had seen. That is the part that stays with me most. Not the face in the shadow of the cap, though that stays with me too. The almost. The careful, patient, imperfect mimicry. Whatever held that land had been watching the road long enough to try wearing what it saw. That kind of patience belongs to something that has no particular sense of urgency about what happens next. That has been there long enough that a few mail carriers going by on a rerouted track is just one more thing it has time to study. Before I give you the rule, I want to say one thing about Owen that I have not mentioned yet. When we got back to Ely that evening, I sat in the post office parking lot for about 20 minutes before going inside to file the report. Owen sat with me. Neither of us had said much on the drive back. When I finally asked him what he had seen on the close pass, where we drove by the figure at walking speed, and it was right there in the passenger window, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he saw something that had been practicing being a person for a very long time and had almost gotten it right. He said the almost was the part he kept coming back to. That something had been watching closely enough and for long enough to get that close to a correct imitation. I did not have anything to add to that. I went inside and filed the disruption report. Owen finished his route familiarization the following week with a different carrier on a different route. He was assigned a route in the north section of the county, paved roads, no BLM land, no reroutes. He has been running it for 3 years now. He has never requested a transfer to a more remote assignment. I do not think that is a coincidence. I have run many miles of Nevada high desert route in 9 years. I will run many more. Here is the rule I carry now on any section of BLM land that crosses near rock art, petroglyph sites, or any terrain feature that looks like it might have been significant to people before the road was there. You watch the clock the way you watch your fuel gauge, not casually, but with the awareness that running out has consequences. When the sun gets within 20 minutes of the ridge, you stop servicing stops on that section and you drive to the gravel. You do not wait for one more stop. You do not let the route convince you there is time. There is not always time. And if something is standing in the road ahead of you, pointing you forward, in an old uniform that is almost right, understand that the direction it is pointing is not a place it wants you to go. It is the direction it wants you to come from, on your way back. When the light is gone and the gravel is not where you left it, get to the cattle guard, cross it before the sun clears the ridge. Whatever is holding that land does not follow past the iron, and if you have a rider with you, pay attention to what they say. Sometimes the person who has not yet learned to rationalize things is the one who sees most clearly. Owen described it better than I could have. Almost right, that is the tell. If something is almost right, it has been watching. And if it has been watching long enough to get that close, it has been there far longer than any road that passes through its ground. Story 4. Search and rescue 6 of us went into those foothills. 4 of us made it back to the trailhead. We don't talk about what happened to the other 2, not because they're dead, but because what they saw broke something in them that hasn't come back. I have been doing volunteer search and rescue work in New Mexico for 11 years. Before that, I did 4 years with a county SAR team in Colorado, so I have been at this for the better part of 15 years all told. I want to establish that because what I am going to tell you might be easier to dismiss if you thought I was a newcomer, someone who panicked in the dark and misread what they saw. I did not panic. I misread nothing. What I saw was what it was, and what it was is something I have been working out language for ever since. The Sandia Mountains east of Albuquerque are not wilderness in the technical sense. The Sandia Peak Tramway runs to the crest. There are developed campgrounds and maintained trails, and a ski area and a highway that crosses through the northern reach of the range. During the day, in good weather, the lower foothills see recreational traffic consistent with any metro-adjacent open space. Hikers, mountain bikers, trail runners, people out for an evening walk. The trails are well signed and moderately well maintained. The area where we deployed that November was the southeastern foothills section, lower elevation, drier terrain, away from the ski infrastructure and the tram, pinon and juniper on the lower slopes, some ponderosa higher up, rocky, broken ground with shallow arroyos and basalt outcrops that can make navigation tricky if you wander off the maintained trails. Not wilderness, but enough terrain to get a person thoroughly lost, especially after dark, especially if they left the trail. The missing person was a man named Leonard, 63, who had started a day hike on the Three Gun Spring Trail that Tuesday morning. He was an experienced hiker, according to his wife, who had filed the missing person report when he did not return by 5 in the afternoon. He had his phone, water, and a day pack. His car was still in the trailhead parking lot when she came looking. His phone was going to voicemail. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office activated our team at about 6:30 that evening. By the time we assembled and drove to the trailhead, it was close to 8. There were 6 of us on the deployment that night, myself and our team leader, a woman named Carrie, who had been running our unit for 8 years and who I have more respect for than almost anyone I have worked with in any context. Carrie is the kind of search and rescue leader who plans for everything she can foresee and adapts to everything she cannot, and who keeps her voice level regardless of what the terrain or the situation is doing. I have watched her run a debrief after a recovery, meaning a deployment that ended with a body rather than a living person, with the same quiet steadiness she brought to routine training. I trusted her judgment completely. The other experienced members were Troy and Hector. Troy was a retired firefighter from Albuquerque, 5 years on the SAR team, the kind of man who moves efficiently in broken terrain and never complains about conditions. Hector was a wilderness medicine instructor who had been with us for 7 years and whose medical training had been directly useful on at least 3 prior deployments I could remember. Both of them were people I would want beside me on any difficult night in the field. The 2 newer members were Stephen and Yara. Stephen was 28, a software engineer by day, had done his certifications the previous spring and been on 4 deployments, all routine and uneventful. Yara was 31, had a background in competitive trail running and a calm head, had been on 6 deployments. Both of them were solid, neither of them was inexperienced. I want to be clear about that before I describe what happened to them, because what happened to them did not happen because they were unprepared. It happened because of what was in those foothills and what it was willing to do. We suited up at the trailhead with headlamps, radios, bear spray, thermal layers, and first aid kits. Carrie briefed us on Leonard's planned route, which his wife had described from notes he had left that morning, up the Three Gun Spring Trail to the spring, then back down the same way. About a 6-mile round trip. He had started at 9 in the morning. That gave him potentially 11 hours of daylight, and then another 2 or 3 before the temperature dropped below safe exposure levels for a person without overnight gear. It was now past 8 in the evening, temperature around 37 degrees, with a wind that put the effective chill well below freezing. Carrie split us into 3 pairs. She and I would run the main trail. Troy and Stephen would cover the southern drainage. Hector and Yara would push west toward the basalt ridgeline, where the trail sometimes saw people cut off route toward the rock features. All 3 pairs would maintain radio contact every 15 minutes. Standard missing person deployment, the kind we had run many times. We were 20 minutes up the trail when I noticed the first thing that was wrong. I want to describe the terrain first, because it matters for understanding what happened later. The Three Gun Spring Trail runs northeast from the trailhead, climbing through open pinon juniper scrub for the first mile before the vegetation thickens and the grade steepens. The lower section has good sightlines. You can see 100 yards in most directions during daylight. Less at night because the juniper casts deep shadow and the basalt outcrops interrupt the beam of a headlamp in ways that can confuse distance and direction. The arroyo system that drains the southeastern foothills crosses the trail twice in the lower section, each crossing marked with a small cairn and a brown post. Both crossings were dry that night. The soil on the trail was the typical sandia mix, decomposed granite over sandy clay, firm on the main trail, soft in the arroyo channels where sediment accumulates, cold. The temperature at trail level was probably 34 degrees when we started, dropping toward 30 as the night went on. In that terrain, in the dark, with 6 headlamps creating a pool of moving light and leaving everything beyond 20 or 30 yards in complete blackness, sound behaves in specific ways. The basalt outcrops reflect it, the arroyos channel it. A voice carrying across open desert often seems to come from the wrong direction because of how it bounces off rock faces before reaching you. I know this. I have been in terrain like this many times. I accounted for it when we started hearing things later. I was still wrong about what I was hearing. Leonard's GPS track, his wife had been able to share it from a fitness app he used, and the sheriff's dispatch had forwarded it to Carrie's phone before we left the parking lot. I had looked at it briefly in the car. The track showed him going up the trail normally, reaching the spring at about 11:30 in the morning, and then heading back down. About a mile below the spring, the track looped. A complete loop, off-trail, through a section of the foothills I knew from prior deployments. Then the track came back to the main trail, continued downhill for maybe 3/10 of a mile, and stopped. A person who loops off trail and then comes back to the main path and then stops is not a person who got lost going uphill. A person who loops off trail in a complete circle and then exits the circle at the same point they entered, it is not behaving in any way consistent with purposeful navigation or even with disoriented wandering. Disoriented people walk in expanding spirals. They do not walk in neat circles and then continue purposefully down the main trail. I have looked at hundreds of GPS tracks from search and rescue deployments over 15 years. I have seen the tracks of people who got lost, people who were injured and moving in circles from pain-induced disorientation, people who were dehydrated or hypothermic and navigating with the impaired judgment that comes from those conditions. I have never seen a track that looked like Leonard's track. The loop was too clean. The return to the trail at precisely the entry point of the loop was too precise. The continuation down the trail after the loop, for exactly 3/10 of a mile, to an apparently deliberate stopping point, read like a track made by a person who knew where they were going, not a person who was lost. Or it read like a track made by something guiding a person who did not know where they were going. I showed the track to Carrie. She looked at it for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Let's see what's at the end of the track." The track ended in a dry arroyo about 3/10 of a mile below where the loop reconnected with the main trail. We found Leonard's gear at the arroyo rim, his pack unzipped, contents arranged in a row on a flat rock at the edge, water bottle, first aid kit, emergency whistle, snack bag, folded map, arranged in a row, not dumped, not scattered by a fall or by wildlife, arranged with the same deliberate neatness that I associate with a person who wants to be found, or with a scene that has been prepared to look like a person who wants to be found. Leonard was not there. I radioed Carrie, and she came up from the trail to look. She stood at the arroyo rim and looked at the gear, and then looked down into the arroyo, which was maybe 8 feet deep at that point, the bank steep and sandy, empty, dry. No sign of a fall, no disturbed vegetation on the steep bank, no foot or slide marks in the sandy floor below. Then we heard his voice. Before I tell you about the voice, I want to tell you about the gear staging more carefully, because it is the detail that I think most clearly communicates what we were dealing with before the voices started. When I said the gear was arranged in a row, I mean it was arranged in a specific, deliberate sequence. Water bottle, first aid kit, emergency whistle, snack bag, folded map, each item placed at roughly equal intervals along the flat rock surface, each item oriented with its label or opening facing up, not dumped, not dropped in haste, not left in the random arrangement that results from a pack being upended or dropped by a falling person, placed the kind of placement that requires time and thought and an intention to communicate something. I took photographs of the staging before we touched anything. I still have those photographs. The arrangement is precise in a way that is hard to convey without showing them. It looks like something a person with excellent organizational habits might do before going to sleep in a tent. Everything laid out, everything accessible, everything exactly where it needs to be. Leonard was 63 and, according to his wife, kept a very tidy house and was methodical about his gear. So it was possible, just possible, that this was Leonard staging his gear before lying down somewhere in the arroyo to rest. That was the most charitable interpretation. The arroyo below the staging site was empty. That was what made the charitable interpretation difficult to maintain. From the arroyo, from below us, from somewhere in the dark channel, maybe 30 feet east, along the curve of the bank. "Hello? Is someone there?" Leonard's voice, which I knew from the brief phone conversation our team coordinator had had with his wife, who had played us his voicemail greeting so we would recognize him. Male voice, older, slight New Mexico accent, calling up from the dark below the rim. Carrie moved immediately to the east, following the arroyo rim toward the sound. I was 2 steps behind her. We called back, identified ourselves as SAR, told him to keep talking. He called again from the same direction, same distance, same tone. We reached the position and looked down. The arroyo floor was visible in our headlamp beams. Empty. The voice came again. Not from the arroyo. From behind us. From the west. From the direction we had come from. The same voice, the same words, the same cadence. I turned around. The arroyo rim behind me was empty. The juniper scrub beyond the rim was dark. Carrie had turned too. We stood at the rim with our headlamps pointing in different directions, and the voice came a third time, from the south, maybe 40 yards, at ground level on the flat above the arroyo. Carrie said, quietly, "Do not go toward it." I want to pause on that moment, because it is the one that I have replayed the most often in the time since. She said it immediately, without hesitation, before she had any definitive evidence that what we were hearing was not Leonard. She said it the way experienced people sometimes say things they know before they can fully explain why they know them. 8 years of running search and rescue in the Southwest gives a person a set of instincts that operate faster than conscious reasoning. Her instinct, in that moment, was that going toward that voice would be a mistake. I did not argue with her. I have not argued with Carrie's instincts in 11 years. And I was not going to start in a dark arroyo at 9 in the evening. She keyed her radio and called Troy and Hector. She told them to hold position and listen for a voice that might not be Leonard, and under no circumstances to separate from their partners. Troy came back immediately and said they had been hearing something similar in the southern drainage for the past 5 minutes and had not gone toward it. That was when Hector's voice came over the radio, not Hector on the radio. Hector's voice, from the dark off to our northeast, about 60 yards from where we were standing, calling, "Carrie, we found him, over here." Hector's voice, specific enough that I knew it was not a coincidence. The cadence, the slight formality of using her name, the automatic addition of "over here" that Hector always said when he was citing something. Specific enough to know it was not a stranger making noise in the dark. Carrie did not move toward it. She keyed the radio and said, "Hector, acknowledge." Hector's voice came over the actual radio, flat and electronic, from the south. Acknowledged. "We are at our position." That was not me. The voice in the northeast called again. Same words. "Carrie, we found him, over here." And beneath the words, for just a moment, a quality in the sound that was not right. Not distortion, not static, but something organic that sat under Hector's voice like a second register, a lower frequency that a human throat does not produce. I heard it. Carrie heard it. I know, because she took a step back from the direction the sound had come from. I want to be precise about what followed, because I have had to be precise about it many times. In the debrief, in conversations with the cultural resources officer, in my own reconstruction of the night in the weeks and months after, and the precision is how I have stayed clear about what happened versus what I might have imagined or misremembered. Carrie had identified the problem in the first few minutes. Something in the foothills was using voices, specifically voices of people the missing man might know or people on our team, to try to move individuals away from their partners. The mechanism was simple and would have been effective on almost anyone who had not been prepared for it, because the voices were accurate enough to pass the initial fraction of a second test that the brain performs when it hears a familiar sound. For just a moment, every time, some part of me started to respond before the rational layer caught up and asked, "Wait, is that right?" The thing that distinguished what we were hearing from genuine voices was not the sound quality, it was the behavior. Voices move through terrain in consistent ways. A person calling from 40 yards east will sound 40 yards east and will continue to sound 40 yards east as you approach or move away. What we were hearing changed direction without any physical explanation for the change. It would come from the arroyo, then from behind us, then from the south, not as echoes, not with the delay and distortion of a reflected sound, but as a clean, unambiguous source that had simply relocated without passing through the intervening space. That is not how sound works. That is not how anything physical works. Over the next 40 minutes, the thing worked through the team. Not quickly, methodically. Troy's voice from the western slope, calling for Stephen by name, asking him to come look at something. My own voice from the south arroyo, calling for Carrie to check a position she had already cleared. Yara's voice from the north, reporting that she had found a person down, each one specific, each one carrying just enough of the real person's cadence to be plausible for a moment before something in the rendering slipped. Carrie kept the pairs together through all of it. Every voice that came from the dark, she radioed the actual person and confirmed their position before anyone moved. Every confirmation came back correct. Every voice in the dark was a lie. She was calm about it in a way I still find remarkable when I think back on it. Her voice on the radio never changed register. She just kept confirming positions, kept the pairs in contact, kept us moving slowly toward the trailhead. She told me later that during those 40 minutes she never felt fear in the way she would have expected to feel it. What she felt was a very high level of concentration, a narrowing of her awareness down to the specific tactical problem of keeping 5 people moving in the right direction. She said the concentration left no room for the fear to get in. I believe her. I saw her face when we came out of the foothills, and it did not look like a face that had spent 40 minutes in the dark with fear. It looked like a face that had been working a problem. It was the 2 newer members, Stephen and Yara, who went toward the voice. I want to be careful here about the word I use. I said they broke earlier in this account, and I am revising that word because it implies a failure of character or nerve that I do not believe is accurate. What happened to them was that the thing in the foothills found, in each of them, a specific vulnerability that it could use, a voice specific enough to move them before they could stop themselves. That is not a character failure. That is a targeted effort by something that had been listening carefully enough to know which voice would work on which person. Yara responded to Leonard because she was there to find Leonard, and Leonard's voice calling her name specifically created a moment of confusion that bypassed the protocol before the protocol could engage. Stephen responded to Yara's voice because Yara was his partner, and the voice was convincing, and the instinct to go toward a distressed partner is a strong one. Neither response was unreasonable. The thing that used those voices knew that, not together, separately, within about 12 minutes of each other, in a sequence that I have reconstructed from the debrief and from what each of them said afterward when they were willing to say anything at all. Stephen heard Yara's voice calling his name from a position that was inconsistent with where he and Troy were standing. The voice was specific enough, and the apparent distress in it convincing enough, that he moved toward it before Troy could stop him. By the time Troy realized Stephen was gone and radioed in, Stephen had covered enough ground toward the sound that Troy lost visual contact in the dark and the terrain. Yara heard Leonard's voice directly. Not any team member's voice. Leonard's voice, the one we were looking for, calling her name specifically, calling her by name as if he knew her, which Leonard did not because they had never met. The voice knew her name. She went toward it without radioing in. Hector realized she was gone about 4 minutes later when she stopped responding to his direct questions. Troy found the main trail and reached the trailhead at about 11:30 that night. Carrie and I came out 10 minutes after him. Hector came out another 15 minutes after that. We waited at the trailhead for 2 hours before Stephen walked out of the foothills from the south. He had no explanation for the 2 hours. He said the last thing he remembered clearly was going toward what he thought was Yara's voice, and then he was standing on the slope above the parking lot with no awareness of how he had gotten there. He was not injured. He was not in shock in the medical sense. He sat in the parking lot and did not say anything further that night, and when I have spoken to him in the months since, he will confirm that he heard a voice and went toward it, and that is the full extent of what he will say. Yara came out an hour after Stephen. She walked out of the same area from the south alone. She was not injured. She sat in Hector's truck and did not speak for about 40 minutes. When she finally said something, she said she was not going to tell us what she had seen, and she was not going to file a SAR incident report beyond the minimum required. And she had decided to leave the team. She did leave the team. 3 weeks after the deployment, she is still in Albuquerque, still working the same job she had before, by all accounts living a normal life. But I have spoken to people who know her, and the consistent word from people who knew her well before and see her regularly now is that she is different in a way that is hard to name. Not traumatized in any recognizable clinical sense, she is not withdrawn, not fearful, not avoidant of things she used to enjoy. She is present, functional, apparently well. She is just different in this specific way of someone who learned something in a single night that changed the architecture of what they think is possible. The way a person is different after a severe car accident that they walked away from, or after a medical diagnosis that turned out to be wrong but that they lived with for several days before the correction came. Something has been revised that does not fully revise back. Stephen came back to one team meeting after the deployment about a month later and then quietly stopped attending. I have run into him twice in the years since, both times at unrelated locations, and both times he looked at me the way a person looks at someone who was present for a thing they would rather not revisit. Not unfriendly, just careful. He did not bring it up and I did not bring it up, and we talked about other things and went our separate ways. I do not know what either of them saw in those foothills. I do not know what the thing in the dark showed them to produce that specific quality of change, and I am not certain I want to. What I know is that 4 of us who did not go toward the voice walked out of the foothills intact, and the 2 who went toward it came back changed. That is the data. The rule follows from the data. Leonard was found the following morning by the day crew, 6 of whom went in at first light with the coordinates from the previous night's search as their starting point. They found him about a quarter mile from where his gear had been staged, at the arroyo. He was sitting against a pinon tree at the edge of a clearing, conscious, mildly hypothermic, with no memory of the period from roughly noon until the moment he found himself sitting at the tree. His phone was in his jacket pocket. Its battery was dead. His boots were dry. I want to note the boots specifically because I noted them in my incident documentation at the time. The arroyo floor that we had assessed the night before as dry and sandy showed watermarks in the morning, a tide line along the banks, suggesting that water had moved through the channel at some point between our arrival and dawn. There had been no precipitation that night. The watermarks were there, and Leonard's boots were dry, which means he had not been in the arroyo after the water moved through, and which also means something had moved water through a dry channel on a precipitation-free night in November, for reasons that do not have an obvious natural explanation. I filed that observation in my incident report. It is there on record. No one has offered me an explanation for it. He spent 2 nights in the hospital for the hypothermia and was discharged without any other finding. He told the attending physician he had been hiking and got turned around. That was the full extent of what he said to anyone in any official capacity. His wife called me a week after his discharge to thank the team for the search. She asked carefully whether we had encountered anything unusual during the night deployment. I told her we had had some difficulties with acoustics in the terrain. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Leonard had told her one thing about the afternoon he could not remember. He said the last thing he remembered clearly was hearing a voice he recognized calling his name from off the trail. He said the voice had been very specific, very accurate. He had gone toward it. After that, nothing, until the tree. She did not ask me what I thought the voice had been. She thanked me again and got off the phone. Troy came out at 11:30 and sat in the parking lot with his radio until we arrived. He told me afterward that on his way down the trail he had heard my voice from the western slope twice, both times calling him toward a position off the maintained trail. Both times he had radioed me before moving. Both times I was somewhere else entirely. He had kept moving toward the trailhead and not deviated, and whatever was calling him had stopped after the second attempt. He did not sound shaken when he told me this. Troy is not easily shaken. He said it the way he might describe a technical problem he had solved in the field, methodically, with a clear account of the decision he had made and why, and without any evident desire to revisit it. Carrie told me, during the debrief we held 2 weeks later when the team had reassembled, that she had heard Leonard's actual voice once during our return to the trailhead, not a team member's voice. Leonard's voice, calling from the south with an accuracy she described as perfect, accurate in the specific way of something that had spent time with him before we arrived. She said she had not gone toward it because, by that point, she understood the pattern, but that the accuracy of it had stayed with her in a way that the earlier, less convincing attempts had not. She said it had the sound of something that had been practicing. I learned something in the weeks after that deployment that I had not known going in, and I want to pass it along, because it is relevant to understanding what we were operating in that night. The southeastern foothills of the Sandias, in the specific area where our deployment took place, contain a colonial period burial site that was documented by a University of New Mexico archaeological team in the early 1990s. The site is associated with a Spanish colonial outpost from the 17th century, and beneath the colonial period material the archaeologists found evidence of significantly older occupation, ancestral Pueblo material consistent with habitation going back well before European contact. The two occupation layers are spatially overlapping, which is to say that people were buried in the same ground across several hundred years of continuous use. The site is not marked on any public trail map. It does not appear on any signage in the foothills. Its coordinates are on file with the State Historic Preservation Office and the relevant tribal preservation contacts. It is not far from where Leonard's gear was staged, at the Arroyo Rim. It is not far from where Yara and Stephen went when they went toward the voices. A cultural resources officer I spoke with, after I had done enough research to know who to call, told me that the area had a history of what she described as territorial incidents, people reporting disorientation, hearing voices of companions or missing persons from positions where no one was located, and equipment malfunctions during survey work. She said the incidents clustered around the burial area and tended to intensify at night. She said the boundary in every reported incident she was aware of was the trailhead parking lot. She said, "Nothing that happens up there follows anyone back to the pavement." I asked her what she meant by nothing. She said she meant what she said. She said there was a specific character to what was reported from that area, not random paranormal noise, not the general category of strange experiences that people report from anywhere with difficult terrain and a history of deaths, but something consistent, a pattern, voices, separation, the boundary of the parking lot. She said she had reviewed documentation going back about 40 years and the pattern did not change. Whatever was in those foothills had been doing the same thing for longer than she had been working the Historic Preservation Office. I asked her if anyone had ever been seriously harmed. She said that depended on how you defined serious harm. She said 2 people had been found dead in that section of the foothills over the decades, both attributed to exposure, both discovered at locations inconsistent with where they had been last reported. She said exposure was a real and adequate explanation for both deaths given the terrain and the conditions. She said she was not going to make a different claim officially. She paused, And then she said, "But neither of them was found anywhere near where their GPS tracks ended." She was right about the parking lot. Whatever was in those foothills that night, it stopped at the parking lot lights. Troy walked out and it did not follow him. Carrie and I walked out and it did not follow us. Stephen walked out of the south slope, and whatever had pulled him away from Troy for 2 hours did not follow him to the asphalt. Yara walked out, and whatever she saw in the dark up there stayed there. I want to be precise about this for anyone who does SAR work, or who hikes in the Sandias, or who finds themselves in terrain anywhere in the southwest where the foothills hold something that sounds like the people you came with. The voice is the mechanism. That is the tool it uses. It is accurate enough to pass a moment's inspection, but it will not hold up under direct questioning. If you hear a voice from a direction that is wrong, radio the person directly before you move. If the voice does not match the radio, do not go toward it. Stay with your partner. Do not let the voice move you away from the person you came with, because that is what it is trying to do. Separation is the goal. Separation is how it works. The parking lot lights are the limit. They were the limit for our team that night, and they have been the limit in every account I have been able to find from that area. Keep moving toward them. If you are in terrain where the parking lot is not visible, move downhill and stay on the maintained trail. The maintained trail will reach the parking lot. The parking lot has lights. The lights are the threshold. Keep moving toward them. If you get to the parking lot, whatever came toward you in the dark did not follow you there. That is not a guarantee. It is an observation. Every account I have been able to find from that area says the same thing. Get to the pavement. It stays where its ground is. Keep your radio on. Keep your partner in sight. Don't go toward the voice. And if you are leading a team in terrain like that, if you are the carry in this story, do not wait to see if the voice is real before you tell your people not to move toward it. Your instincts will know before your reasoning does. Trust them. The 2 people on my team who went toward the voice did so because the instinct fired, and they followed it before they had time to question it. Carrie's instinct fired the other direction. She said, "Do not go toward it," before she had any evidence. That is the instinct you want in command of a team in those hills. Develop it. Listen to it. It will be right before you know why. Story 5. The fence line the ranch owner told me not to go past the old marker post. Said it plain, no explanation. I didn't listen. It's been 3 weeks, and I still can't sleep with the lights off. I have been building fence in the high desert of northern Arizona for 18 years. I do not say that to establish authority. I say it because 18 years in that country teaches you things you cannot learn any other way. And one of the things it teaches you is the difference between land that is empty and land that is occupied in a way that doesn't show on any map. The job outside Winslow came through a referral from a ranch supply dealer in Holbrook who knew I did quality work and could manage a rural site without hand-holding. The client was a man named Aldrich, who had recently acquired 310 acres of high desert land east of Winslow in the rolling scrubland south of Interstate 40. He wanted a perimeter fence, standard 4-strand barbed wire on steel T-posts, roughly 5.5 miles of fence line enclosing the full property boundary. It was a 2 to 3 day job for a 2-man crew with the right equipment. Easy money. I had done dozens of similar jobs in Navajo and Coconino counties and had the workflow down to a routine. My helper on the job was a man named Garrett Cruz. Garrett had been working with me off and on for 4 years, picking up fence and post work when my volume was high and returning to his other work when it was not. He was a good field hand, strong, methodical, not given to complaining, knew how to operate the post driver without supervision. He did not need to be told twice about anything, which is the quality I value most in a field partner on a remote 2-day job. He was also from the region in a way that I was not. His family had been in the Winslow area for 3 generations. His grandfather had worked cattle on the surrounding ranches and knew the land at a level of detail that does not come from maps. Garrett had grown up hearing his grandfather talk about the country, which washes ran in a wet year, which springs were reliable, which sections of land had histories that older people in the area were careful about. He carried that knowledge the way people carry things they grew up with, not as something they think about consciously, but as a layer of interpretation underneath their ordinary perception. I knew Garrett well enough to know that when he said something was worth paying attention to, it was worth paying attention to. I did not pay enough attention on this job. That is the part I have to own. I want to tell you about Garrett's reaction when we first arrived on the property, before anything had happened, because it is relevant to understanding what followed. We drove through the gate at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday in late April. Aldrich had left the combination in a voicemail and told us he would be in Phoenix through Friday, that we had full access to the property and should leave the gate locked when we weren't actively hauling in materials. The access road was about a mile of rough 2-track from the county road to the approximate center of the property, where a small equipment shed and a concrete pad marked the future site of a ranch house. We parked there, unloaded the post driver from the trailer, and I unrolled the property plat to walk Garrett through the fence line plan. The morning was clear and cold, mid-40s. The kind of April morning in the high desert that can go either way. Sometimes the temperature drops back to freezing by noon if the clouds come in. Sometimes it climbs to the 70s by afternoon. The country around the property was open in every direction, the kind of open that makes you aware of your own smallness in it. The volcanic basalt formations visible to the east and north gave the terrain its character, dark outcrops rising from the pale scrub at intervals that made the land look older than it already was. This part of Arizona carries its age on the surface. You do not have to dig to find it. He looked at the plat for a moment. Then he looked north. The northern section of the property was about 400 yards from where we were standing. Open scrubland, low juniper. A slight rise in the terrain where the land rolled up toward a shallow ridge before dropping away to the north. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize from a description rather than from personal memory. He asked me what was on the north end of the property. I told him scrub, the same as everywhere else. He was quiet. Then he said he thought he knew where this property was, and he thought there was something on the north end that I should know about before we started the fence line. I asked him what he meant. He said there was ground in this area that the Hopi considered significant, that the land north of the ridgeline had a history, and that he was not sure exactly where the property boundary sat in relation to that history. He asked if I had done any cultural resource consultation with the title search. I told him the title search had come back clean. He said that was different from a cultural resource clearance. I said I understood that, and that if anything came up we would stop and address it, and that for now we were going to run the south and west boundary lines and assess the north boundary when we got to it. He agreed to that. I should have listened more carefully to the way he said it. We ran the south boundary line through the morning without incident. The terrain was cooperative, gently rolling, T-posts going in clean, wire stringing without the snags and tangles that can eat an afternoon on rocky ground. The soil on the south section was a sandy loam with some caliche hardpan in the deeper layers, manageable with the post driver on its standard setting. We worked without a lot of conversation, the way Garrett and I usually worked. Efficient, task-focused, the kind of silence that is productive rather than uncomfortable. The property had a quality of openness that I appreciated. From the south boundary line you could see the full sweep of the parcel northward, the land rolling gently up toward the ridge that marked the approximate center of the property. Beyond the ridge, invisible from where we were working, was the north section. The juniper on the north face of the ridge, even seen from a distance, looked denser than the scrub on the south side. Darker. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed it at some point in the morning and registered it as a terrain observation without attaching any significance to it. Denser juniper on a north-facing slope is normal. The north side of any ridge in the high desert holds more moisture and more vegetation. That is all it was. That is what I told myself at the time. By noon we had the south line done, and were working the west line north toward the ridge. What I noticed at about 2 in the afternoon, working the west line, about 100 yards below the crest of the north ridge, was a post. Not one of ours. An old one. A juniper corner post. Hand adze. So old that the wood had gone gray and checked with age. sitting just inside our survey line at a position that corresponded to what I would call a natural landscape corner, a point where the terrain turned, where the scrubland gave way to a slightly rockier substrate, and the vegetation composition shifted towards something drier and sparser. The post had no wire attached to it, no hardware. It was just a post, driven in the ground at some point in the past, standing at the point where the terrain changed. There was a small cairn of flat stones at the base of it, 5 or 6 flat sandstone pieces, stacked with care, the edges even, not collapsed from weather. The top stone was level. Someone had maintained it, or the original construction had been solid enough that it held through the years without intervention. Beside the cairn, barely visible in the soil, were the remnants of what might once have been additional marker material, smaller stones in a line extending east from the post, most of them now level with the ground surface, readable as a line only if you were already looking for it. I crouched at the base of the post. The wood had gone gray all the way through, not surface weathering, but deep, complete desiccation from decades in the arid climate. The post was solid, though, no rot, no insect damage. Whatever wood it had been cut from was the kind that persists in dry country for a very long time. I could not read any mark or stamp on it that would tell me when it had been driven or by whom. I called Garrett over. He looked at the post and the cairn for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "This is the marker post." I asked what that meant. He said he did not know its full history, but that he had heard his grandfather talk about a marker that stood at the edge of Old Hopi grazing territory in this part of the county. A boundary marker, older than any fence line. He said he thought we should note its position carefully and talk to Aldrich before we ran the north fence line past it. I noted the position on the plat. I radioed Aldrich on the number he had left and got his voicemail. I left a message describing what we had found and asking him to call back before we started the north boundary work. Then I made a decision. I have had a long time to reconsider. I told Garrett we would continue working the west line up to the marker post position and then hold, and that we would wait for Aldrich's call before crossing that threshold with the fence. We worked to the marker post and stopped. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon. Aldrich had not called back. I looked at the north section of the property. The ridge was maybe 100 yards ahead. Beyond it I could not see, but based on the plat, the north boundary line was about 200 yards past the ridge line. About 300 yards of fence line, an hour's work at our pace, and the north section would be done. We were ahead of schedule. The weather was good. The light was going to hold for at least 3 more hours. I made the call to continue. Garrett did not argue. He picked up his end of the wire spool, and we moved past the marker post. The first thing that happened was small enough that I noticed it, and then set it aside. About 30 yards past the marker post, the post driver stopped firing clean. The hydraulic line that drives the hammer had been functioning perfectly all day. It did not malfunction in any mechanical sense. I could identify the pressure gauge read normal. The line showed no kink or leak, but the driving action became erratic. 3 clean drives, and then a half-strength drive, 3 clean and then a half-strength. Consistent enough that I noted it as a pattern rather than a random malfunction. Inconsistent enough with the machine's normal behavior that I could not explain it. I drove posts. The pattern continued. I stopped looking at it as a malfunction and started working around it, doubling back to fully see any post that had gotten a half-strength drive. We reached the ridge line and continued down the north face. The ground on the north side of the ridge was different from the south. Not dramatically, it was still juniper scrub on sandy loam, still the same general high desert character, but the soil color was darker in patches, the organic content higher in a way that showed in the color and texture when a post went in and threw up a plug of earth. And there were stones. Not many, not obvious at first glance, but arranged in a way that I recognized after Garrett pointed the first one out. Flat stones, placed at intervals along what would have been the natural contour of the land. Not random scatter, not geologically deposited material, placed. Garrett stopped working. He stood holding his end of the wire spool and looked at the ground around us. Then he said, quietly, "We are inside something." I asked what he meant. He He said the stone arrangements were the remnants of a boundary, not a fence line, something older. He said the area inside the boundary was likely associated with the ground his grandfather had described. He said we should stop and go back. I looked at the plat. The north boundary fence line was about 150 yards ahead. An hour of work, 1 hour. I said we would note the stone features, document them carefully, and complete the north line. I said we would report everything to Aldrich and to whatever state office needed to be involved. I said we were not doing anything irreversible by completing the fence line. Garrett put down his end of the wire spool. He said he was going to walk back to the truck. He said if I wanted to continue, he would wait for me there, but he was not going to keep working past the stone boundary line. He walked back over the ridge. I stood for a moment at the edge of the stone boundary line and looked at the north section ahead of me. The fence line I needed to run was visible as a series of flagged positions I had marked from the plat before we started, small orange flags on wire stakes, positioned at intervals along the survey line. They ran north from where I was standing toward the property boundary, about 150 yards of work, 1 hour. I thought about calling Aldrich again. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds, standing there with the post driver idling in the late afternoon light coming at a low angle across the scrub. Then I thought about the schedule and the drive back to Winslow, and the fact that Garrett was already at the truck and I was already here, and it was 1 hour of work. I crossed the stone boundary line alone. I want to tell you about the north side of the ridge, because I have not described it yet and the description matters. The ground on the north face dropped away at a shallower grade than the south face, extending about 200 yards to where the property boundary ran along a low natural feature, a slight depression in the terrain, where two drainage patterns met. The vegetation on the north face was indeed denser, the juniper taller and closer set, the scrub between the trees holding more moisture and more species of plant than the drier south side. The soil color, as I noted earlier, was darker in patches, a deep, almost black color in the low spots where organic material had accumulated, and the land had a quality of attention that I cannot describe more precisely than that. The same quality I have occasionally noticed in other sections of high desert in the southwest, that active quality of silence, the sense of being in a space that is aware of you. I have tried over the years to find a physical explanation for that quality. I have not found one that fully accounts for it. What I know is that some pieces of land have it and some do not, and the north section of Aldrich's property had it strongly enough that I was aware of it from the first post I drove past the ridgeline. I kept working. I want to be honest about what I was thinking at that point, because I think it is important. I was thinking about the job. I was thinking about the schedule and the invoice, and the fact that I had told Aldrich I would have the perimeter done in 2 to 3 days. I was thinking about the fact that I had run hundreds of fence lines in the southwest and had found cultural material on a handful of them, and had never had anything happen that could not be addressed through the proper documentation. Channels. I was not superstitious. I had listened to Garrett and noted what he said, and I had made a professional judgment that completing the work and reporting everything afterward was the correct approach. Within about 15 minutes of working alone, I understood that I had made the wrong call. The first indication was the sound. Working fence alone is noisy work. The post driver is loud. The wire has its own metallic sound when it tensions. The T-posts ring when the hammer hits them. All of that was there. But beneath it, at the edge of audibility, was something else. A sound at the frequency of a voice carrying from a distance, not distinct enough to identify as words, but rhythmic enough to be deliberate. It seemed to come from the north, from the direction I was working toward. It did not move. It was consistent, steady, and at a level just below comprehension. I kept working. At the third post past the stone boundary, I heard Garrett's voice behind me. Clear, close, normal speaking volume. Hey, I changed my mind. Let me take the wire spool. I want to be specific about what made it convincing. It was not just the voice, it was the content. The wire spool was the specific piece of equipment Garrett had been carrying before he walked back to the truck. The thing that spoke in Garrett's voice knew that. It had been watching closely enough and recently enough to know what Garrett had been carrying 10 minutes earlier. That level of specific current, accurate detail in the content of what it said is what kept me standing with my back to it for a moment before I turned around. I turned around, no one was there. The ridgeline was visible, maybe 130 yards back. No one on the slope between me and the ridge, no figure at the crest. The scrub between me and the ridge was too low and sparse to conceal a person. I keyed my radio and called Garrett. He responded from the truck, at the equipment shed, his voice coming through the radio with the slight compression of the transmission. He said he had not moved from the truck in 20 minutes. He asked if I was all right. I told him I had thought I heard him and that it was probably the wind through the fence wire. He said there was no wind at the truck. I told him I was finishing the north line and I would be back within the hour. I was wrong about the hour. Over the next 40 minutes, working those final 150 yards of fence line, I heard my own name said twice more from positions where no one was standing. The first time, from the east, from a direction perpendicular to my work line, in a voice I did not recognize. The second time, from directly behind me, in a voice that was Aldrich's, which I recognized from his voicemail, the one I had called back earlier in the afternoon, the one he had not yet answered. Aldrich's voice, saying my name, from the open scrub 10 yards behind me. I did not turn around the second time. I drove the final post, strung the final wire length, twisted off the connection at the north boundary corner, and walked back over the ridge without stopping. The sound that had been at the edge of audibility continued until I was about 20 yards from the marker post. Then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. I crossed the marker post going south. I got back to the truck at a little before 6 in the evening. Garrett was sitting in the passenger seat of the cab. He looked at me when I opened the driver's door and he said, "What happened?" I told him what I had heard, all of it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you see anything?" I had not during the work. But I want to tell you what I saw that night, because this is not where the story ends. We decided to camp on the property rather than drive back to Winslow in the dark on the bad 2-track road. We had a camp set up in the trailer for exactly this situation on remote jobs. We ate, we ran a small light off the truck's secondary battery, and we turned in early. I was in my sleeping bag in the trailer by 9. At some point in the night, I could not have said what time, somewhere past midnight, I woke up, not gradually, fully, suddenly awake. The way you wake when something has changed in your immediate environment without your knowing exactly what. I lay still and listened. After about 30 seconds, I heard it. Footsteps. Outside the trailer. On the gravel and packed dirt of the equipment pad. Slow. Measured. Walking the perimeter of the trailer in the same direction, the same pace, over and over. Not heavy enough to be a large animal. Not light enough to be a small one. Measured in the way that deliberate things are measured. I waited. Garrett was breathing the slow, regular breath of someone asleep across from me. I did not wake him. The footsteps continued for what I estimate was about 20 minutes. Then they stopped. Not receding, stopping. The way sound stops when the source stops, rather than when the source moves away. I lay awake until first light. I did not hear the footsteps again. What I thought about, lying in the dark in the trailer with the light from the truck's secondary battery casting a dim orange glow through the trailer window, was the quality of patience in what I had heard. The footsteps had not hurried. They had not paused, and rushed, and paused again the way an animal moves when it is curious about something and uncertain. They had been even, deliberate, the same pace, all the way around, the same rhythm, over and over, for 20 minutes. That kind of patience belongs to something that is not anxious, something that has time. I also thought about the stopping. The footsteps had stopped at a line. I did not know exactly where the line was until the morning, when I found the soft soil strip on the north side and saw that the marks crossed it twice and then did not continue past it. The concrete pad was the boundary. Not the edge of the campsite in any abstract sense. The physical edge of the concrete, the line where the pad ended and the soft ground began. The marks in the soft ground represented the approach to that line, not a crossing of it. Whatever walked the perimeter that night had stopped at the concrete every time around. In the morning I walked the perimeter of the trailer and the equipment pad before I said anything to Garrett. The soil on 3 sides of the trailer was packed enough that it would not hold a clear impression. The fourth side on the north had a strip of softer sandy soil between the concrete pad and the base of the small equipment shed. I found marks in that strip. Not clear boot prints, not clear enough to identify with certainty, but a sequence of impressions spaced at an interval consistent with a walking pace, crossing the sandy strip twice in the direction of the trailer's perimeter walk. Consistent in spacing and depth, with something large enough to be a person. Nothing else I could identify. I photographed the marks. I did not show them to Garrett immediately. I made coffee, ate, and then told him what I had heard. He listened without expression. Then he looked at the north end of the property, at the ridge, and he said, "We should not have gone past the marker post." I agreed with him. Aldrich called back at 8:30 that morning. I gave him a full account, the marker post, the stone boundary features, what I had heard while working the north line, what I had heard overnight at the trailer. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he told me that when he had acquired the property, the seller had mentioned that the north section of the land was subject to an informal traditional use agreement with a neighboring tribal community, and that the community's preference was that the north section not be fenced. He said he had intended to discuss this with me before we started the north boundary work. He said he had not expected us to reach the north section on the first day. He said he was sorry he had not called back sooner. I told him the north fence line was complete. He was quiet again. Then he asked me, in a careful way, whether I or Garrett had experienced anything during the overnight that I would describe as frightening. I told him about the footsteps and the marks in the soft soil. He said he would need to contact the relevant tribal preservation contacts and determine what steps were required. He said he was not going to ask me to go back out to the property, and that he would handle the removal of the north boundary fence himself with a different contractor. He asked if I could provide documentation of the cultural features I had found. I told him I had photographs and field notes and would send everything to him that day. He said before he got off the phone, "I should have called you back sooner. I am sorry." I told him I should have waited for his call. That was also true. The north boundary fence, I learned about 2 months later, was subsequently removed. Aldrich arranged for it to be taken down and the posts pulled, and the property's boundary agreement with the neighboring community was formalized in writing. The marker post was left in place. The property eventually sold to a different buyer who did not attempt to fence the north section. Garrett said almost nothing on the drive back to Winslow that evening. He sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window and answered my direct questions in short sentences and did not volunteer anything beyond what I asked. He was not angry. He was not frightened in any way I could read in the conventional sense. He had the quality of a person who has had something confirmed that they had already suspected and who is working out what that confirmation means for how they move through the world going forward. He submitted his time for the 2 days, and I paid him within the week. He took one more job with me after that, a fence repair on a ranch in Coconino County with no unusual features, entirely routine. After that, he stopped calling for work. I have not heard from him in about 18 months. I do not think he stopped calling because of anything I did on a personal level. I think he stopped calling because he had a radius of land he was willing to work in, and that radius no longer included the area around Winslow, and enough of my work was in that area that the math did not work for him anymore. I understand that. If I am honest, there are sections of Navajo County that I now make a point of not bidding on, and not just the north section of Aldrich's former property. I have thought many times about the ranch owner's instruction. The instruction he gave me in the voicemail that I had not listened carefully enough to. He had said, "Do not go past the old marker post." He had said it plainly. He had not given me an explanation, and I had not asked for one, and when I did not hear back from him in time, I had made the call myself. That is on me. I know it is on me. What I also know is this: whatever is holding that north section of land had been holding it for longer than the fence line existed, longer than Aldrich's title, longer than any deed recorded in Navajo County. The marker post was there before any of that. The stone boundary was there before any of that. The thing that walked the perimeter of my trailer at midnight and stopped at the line where the concrete pad met the soft soil on the north side, it stopped at a line. It observed a boundary. It did not cross into the trailer, did not approach the truck, did not do anything that I would describe as threatening. It walked the perimeter and it stopped, and in the morning I found its marks in the soft soil and photographed them and added them to my documentation. I have slept with the lights on for 3 weeks since that job. Not out of fear, exactly, or not only out of fear. Out of a specific unsettled quality that comes from having crossed a line you were told not to cross, and having had the crossing noted by something that was paying very close attention. I have also thought, many times, about what Garrett said when I asked him, a week after the job, on the phone, whether he had any sense of what we had been dealing with out there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said his grandfather had described the northern section of that area as ground that had been under a specific stewardship for as long as anyone in his family could remember. He said the word his grandfather used was not a word he was going to put into English on a phone call. He said the important thing was that the ground was held, and that things that were held by something, and that the marker post was there so that people who did not know what they were dealing with would have a clear indication of where to stop. He said, the post wasn't there to keep it in. It was there to tell us where to stay out. I think about that a lot. The marker post as a courtesy to trespassers, rather than a constraint on what's being guarded. A clear, legible signal placed at the boundary of something's ground, put there by people who understood what the ground held and wanted to give anyone who came after a chance to know where the line was. A chance I had and did not use. Here is what I carry now, and I carry it on every job I take in the high desert, which means I carry it constantly. If you are doing field work in the Southwest and a landowner gives you an instruction about a specific boundary marker, a post, a cairn, a line of stones, anything that reads as deliberate and old and placed at a landscape feature, rather than arbitrarily treat that instruction as a hard stop. Do not cross it until you understand what it marks. The explanation may not be immediately available. Wait for it. Call the State Preservation Office. Call the relevant tribal historic preservation contact. Ask the seller. Ask anyone who has worked the adjacent land for more than 10 years. Someone knows what the marker is for. The hour you save by not asking is not worth what the hour costs. If you cross that line and the post driver starts behaving in a way it has never behaved on any prior job, pull back. That is data. Equipment that has been running clean all day does not develop erratic behavior at the same moment you cross an old marker line by accident. Take the malfunction seriously as information about where you are and what you are near. And if you find yourself working land where the rocks are arranged in a way that reads as deliberate, concentric, or in a line along a contour, or at regular intervals that are too consistent to be geologically deposited, stop before you cross that line with your equipment. You can document it and leave. You can flag it for the landowner and come back when you know what you are dealing with. What you cannot do, once you have crossed it and driven post through what it was marking, is undo it. The post driver does not care about what the soil remembers. But whatever held that ground before your client acquired the title does care. It has been holding it long enough to be patient about it. That patience does not mean it is safe. It means it has time. And if you are camped on a piece of land where something has been tracking your work all day, and the night comes and you hear footsteps that stop when they reach the nearest line, whatever line, the concrete edge, the old post line, the threshold of what you have brought with you, understand that the stopping is a choice, not a limit. Whatever it is, it can reach the line. It is choosing not to cross it. That distinction should not comfort you. It should make you very careful about what you do in the morning. That is 5 accounts from 5 different people working in the Southwest, 5 jobs, 5 stretches of land, 5 encounters with something that has been holding ground in the high desert for longer than any of us have been alive. None of us were looking for it. None of us wanted what we found. All of us made it back. If any of this sounds like something you have experienced or something someone you know has described, I want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments where you were, what you were doing, what you saw or heard. And if you have been sitting on a story like this for years because you did not think anyone would believe it, consider this your invitation. We believe it. If you are new here, welcome. Stay as long as you need to. The light is on.